will be here. Barbara's here. She just was excellent. And close. Gary, I thought I saw Gary.
You may be out in the...
Did you see Gary?
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Good morning. For the record, my name is Jason Robinson, co-chair. We're going to start off this morning with public comment, but before we do, I want to just say thank you to our hosts last night for a wonderful tour, reception, and discussion afterwards. It was a really good evening. It's always nice to get out and see some projects on the ground and take a look at the beautiful country that's out there, so thank you once again for that. So our public comment period will begin, and our first commenter is with the Oregon Conservation Partnership. So we have three. We have Kelly Beamer, Jan Lee, and Carlene McCable. Good morning.
Morning. Hello again. So for the record, my name is Kelly Beamer with the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts, and I'm here today as part of the Oregon Conservation Partnership. And for those of you who are new to the OWEB board, first of all, welcome, all of you, and thank you for your service. And second of all, we wanted to just take a moment just to pause and say a little bit about what the Oregon Conservation Partnership is and how we work together. And then my colleagues are going to go into a brief report and share some updates. But essentially, the partnership is 4 statewide organizations: COLT, the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, the Oregon Conservation Education and Assistance Network, and the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts. And together we represent SWCDs, land trusts, and councils. We serve a total of 160 individual organizations that are all the primary implementers of Measure 76 funds. And really our members work to bring communities together to restore and protect native fish and wildlife habitat. And just as you know that strong partnerships are critical on the ground to implement effective conservation, our statewide partnership reflects that in what we do. And so about 3 years ago, our boards all came together of the state associations, and we identified 4 areas of work that really guide what we do together and really inform a shared work plan that we have. We meet monthly to track that work plan and implement together. And so the primary things that we focus on are communications and awareness, is building the capacity of councils, districts, and land trusts to tell the conservation story through earned media and other means. We do professional education and training through a monthly webinar and a conference called Connect, an annual conference that we hope you're all always welcome to participate in. Government relations, we track and respond to policies and programs that affect voluntary conservation. And then we support collaborative planning on the ground and really encourage our members and engage with conservation projects where multiple entities are working together. And it's really been a process of learning about what each other do and the tools in our respective toolbox. So that's a little bit about the partnership. As you know, those of you on the board, we come to all the OWEB meetings and provide updates on behalf of our constituents. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Carlene to share a little bit about those updates.
Good morning. I'm Carlene McCabe, and I am serving as the Interim Executive Director for the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. Their director, Sean Morford, for personal reasons, has stepped down, and so I am helping them with this transition. They will be recruiting a permanent ED in the next few months. But I wanted to talk this morning about the piece of the partnership that deals with communications. One of the things we realize, and as OWEB realizes and the board, is that you need to get the word out about all the work that's going on across the state. So over the last couple of years, we have focused on getting earned media placements for a number of articles, and also in developing a website for the partnership and doing webinars for some of our members to continue to get the word out. And over the last couple of years, we've gotten 4 op-eds about the importance of the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund, 7 articles about OWEB grant investments throughout the state, and 8 articles about the importance of the Agricultural Land Conservation Fund. And this earned media, helps to highlight the importance of conservation in Oregon and also shows that it's a statewide effort. and excuse me, it's early morning here, and that the partnership is what makes this happen. So I wanted to pass out to you guys, I'll put them over here, kind of a summary of that earned media. And I think that we can answer questions if you want, and I'll introduce Jan, who is with the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts.
Good morning. For the record, this is Jan Lee, Executive Director of OECD. We have 45 member districts that we work with who take part with councils and members of COLT working together on a number of issues. One of our major roles this year was participating in the legislative session. So we had 2 staff people, we had a lot of help from COLT, and we looked at a great number of bills, but our main objective was trying to get OAHP funded. That didn't work this time, but we are going to keep at it because it's important to all of us and it's important to all of you. We also celebrated OWEB's birthday at the Capitol this year, thanks to all the organizing that COLT did. This fall, we will be doing some tours with legislators and community leaders. The 3 tours that will take place will cover Klamath's Community Forest Program, thanks to the Forest Service for helping us out on that program, and also a farm in southwestern Oregon that is developed in cooperation with the Land Trust, and another site in the lower Willamette, upper Willamette area. We are also getting ready to proceed with the planning for Connect next year. Ocean has put together RFPs, and we should have some dates pretty soon to share with you. And they're in the process now of hiring a person to do that work, to carry out the conference implementation. Thank you.
All right, any questions for the panel? Maida.
Just one comment, Maida Lofsgarden for the record. As some of you know, although we, again, have a number of new board members, OWEB as an agency is very small, and positions like a communications position in an agency the size of ours are pretty hard to come by. And we have somebody who does our website, does graphics for the strategic plan and other things. But the partnership that we have with this group of folks and the communications work that they've been doing is absolutely vital. We've seen since the investment, how long ago did we start that, Kelly? 2 years ago. We've seen not only the media pieces that they talk about here, but they do training at Connect with their staff. We've done lottery training to help folks do local communications efforts, and we've really seen the number of articles generally really going up. And so for an agency that really doesn't have that space and capacity to be doing comms at a level that a lot of other agencies can, we're really lucky to have this partnership. It's been really great, and I just want to give kudos. We've really seen the partnership as a whole grow over time, so thanks to all of you.
And we thank all of you for the support.
Excellent. Any other questions? Thank you guys very much. Next up, under public comments, we have Claire Klock with Klamath Soil and Water Conservation District.
Good morning, board. My name is Claire Klock, and I live in Corbett, Oregon. Part-time or semi-retired employee from the Conservation District, and sort of self-proclaimed resource advocate. I'd like to make a few comments, mostly based on yesterday's discussion, and that is Will got up right away and talked about climate change. I had a visit on my farm from an extension forester last Friday, and we went through to look at the health of the land. And of course, my alders are getting up there and starting to pass out, but we have young alders that are in stress too. And we talked about the drought that's going on. We talked about avenues of what I can do to replace that alder stand without turning it into a brushy open space. Those kind of things. And we also talked about how widespread this particular problem with both alders and Douglas fir and some of the other species. In the course of going to Department of Forestry meetings, this is a discussion that's going on in that realm too. So we're looking at it from all sides, not just from a theoretical, but also from a practical side. On the smoke issue, one of the things that, as a part of going to the number of agency meetings, I hear about the smoke issues, and one of the things we need to call out that you might not be aware of is DEQ and the Oregon Department of Forestry has now changed their smoke incursion rules that allows more smoke at certain times and makes it more practical to do prescribed burning and to do forest health. That's something that's, again, that's an agency partnership that we're seeing. Thank you for your support yesterday on zero-stage restoration monitoring. I just have 3 questions. I'll be interested. I'm sort of a science guy, and so I'd be interested to see if that incised channel is recaptured. Number 2 is if that type of restoration, when done, intermixed with private lands, if it doesn't flood the upstream areas, or if it doesn't slow down the water enough that it makes the agricultural lands downstream wet for a longer period of time, so the operating season there. Thank you for the support of the Land Trust. One of the things that it seems that especially in the last few years, is that conservation easements that's reported in the deed is really the only way to really protect land in perpetuity, because we know that laws can be changed, that national monuments can be overturned, that federal lands next to national parks can be fracked, all of those kind of things. But when you talk about deed restrictions, that seems to be the end as far as the most we can do. Excited, number 5, excited about the comment yesterday, short comment, but it was important that the OWEB staff is dealing with the urban-rural divide, and we might even drill down a little bit farther and talk about how there's a government individual divide, and we see that and this agency seems to be addressing that, so that's a nice thing that's there. 6 is that as part of my SWCD rules, or SWCD duties, I have an opportunity to go to 9 watershed councils in our district. And as far as the Clackamas partnership, the watershed councils are more than ecstatic as far as the amount of work that they're going to be able to do and the funds that they have to do that work. So I just wanted to know you that it's that everybody is highly appreciative. And lastly, I've had a chance to participate in the last 3 or 4 legislatures and 2 or 3 short sessions. And so the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts in the partnership this year has been absolutely incredible as far as putting out information that you, if you check the website, or other people that are interested in conservation can take a really active part in the legislature. I know it just really helped me because it helped me prioritize the stuff that I would go and testify at hearings and zero in on individual legislators. So anyway, that's it, and thank you for the nice tour yesterday. That's boots on the ground.
Great. We have time for one quick question. Anybody has a question? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move along now to agenda item L, and we're going to have Courtney come up and talk about the Council Capacity Grant Awards. Good morning, Courtney.
Good morning. My voice carries. Move that back a little. Good morning, everybody. For the record, Courtney Schaff, Interim Business Operations Manager, and this is agenda item L. There are two topics we're going to cover under this agenda item. The first is the merger funding policy, and the second is the council capacity grant awards. I am going to give a brief overview of both topics, then we'll have a pause for public comment, and then I will come back up here and we'll have board discussion and action. So the first item that we're talking about is the merger funding policy. So there are, the board discussed the merger funding policy at the April board meeting as part of the operating capacity subcommittee's report to the board. And the staff recommendation is two approaches around this policy. The first is to continue to offer the organizational collaboration grants that the board included in the spending plan adopted yesterday. And these grants provide support to organizations that are partnerships, groups of organizations that are doing a variety of activities, including organizations that are seeking to merge into or combine from multiple organizations into one. The second part of this policy is that the OWEB would provide ongoing continued support to organizations after they merge. And this approach is described in attachment A of L1 in your staff report, and this is what we discussed at the April board meeting. And essentially what it does is it provides ongoing funding to organizations after they merge through their council capacity grant, and the amount of funding is dependent on the number of organizations that merge. So I'll pause there for questions on the merger funding policy before I turn the page and begin talking about the council capacity grant awards.
Alan?
Alan Henning for the record. Courtney, I know we talked about the numbers, and the numbers are here for the different types of mergers, the 2, 3, and 4 council mergers. How did we get to those numbers? When you do the calculation percentages, there's not a lot of consistency amongst the 2, 3, and 4. So can you give us a little information on how you arrived at the numbers?
Yes, for the record, Courtney Schaff. So Maida and I did multiple back of the napkin calculations over a series of months. So what we did is essentially we started with what would a number of organizations get before they merged. So what was their amount of funding they had the ability to receive if they were getting full funding prior to merging. And then we thought about what does it cost, initially, and all the research and our work with the Rogue River Watershed Council shows that initially, the first few years after merger, there are some significant costs post-merger. Strategic planning, reorganization, moving offices, and that's what we have provided in funding to the Rogue River Watershed Council is what we called a post-merger implementation grant. So the calculations are based on kind of a decreasing funding amount till you get to a consistent additional funding provided over the years after they get through the initial costs of post-merger implementation. So they're based on some percentages, and we tried to look at recognizing that when fewer organizations are merging, those costs are less because there's less organizational culture that you're changing, there's less boards that you're bringing together. So that is the thought process behind how we came to those numbers.
Okay. That's why the percentages don't align.
That is
Bruce?
correct.
Maybe this is a question for either you or Maida. Is it the position of OWEB that mergers are good?
For the record, Courtney Schaff. In 2013, the OWEB board adopted a policy, which I will touch on when I get to the capacity grants, that we wanted to see councils working together, collaborating, and when possible, merging instead of getting smaller and stretching the limited resources. The Rogue River Watershed Council then came to us independent and said that, 4 watershed councils came to us, which are now the Rogue River Watershed Council, and said, we want to investigate merging. They received one of our first organizational collaboration grants. And I would say those 4 organizations now as one are delivering to that community above and beyond what those individual groups were doing prior to merging, and have staff that are well qualified to do the work, that are staying around and working for those organizations longer. So I would say the opinion of OWEB is that when it's appropriate for those organizations, we would like to see and support mergers when it's a locally decided, local decision.
Thank you.
Other questions for Courtney? And real quick for the record, Jason Robinson, so I just want to remind folks that we do have a public comment period coming up, so if you haven't gotten your yellow sheets, you can go ahead and give those to Kathy so we can get those up. Oh, Stephen, quick question.
Yeah, I'm just trying to look at the numbers again, so I don't really understand the tables. So if, let's just say simply, if two councils merge, normally they get a council capacity grant as individuals, and once they're merged, do they still get those two council capacity grants, or does that amount decline into one council capacity?
For the record, Courtney Schaff, after merger, the new merged organization could apply for one council capacity grant. What we have said through this policy is that OWEB understands that there are actual costs post-merger. So in the short term, they would receive money to help with those post-merger expenses. And then long term, we would provide additional funding on top of the merger to support those additional costs going forward. But they are applying for only one grant.
So I might, for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, actually, if you flip, table 3 is the easiest one. It's on the back side of page 3. So to answer your question, Steve, if you're looking at table 3, before the merger, there were 2 grants, so that's the $236,000. So they had 2 council capacity grants at $118,000 each. After the merger, they get 1 council capacity grant, but they get the added amount in table 2. In column 2. So that $88,000. So they actually get $207,000. They don't ever get as much as they got when they were 2 separate councils, but they get more than just one because there are additional early costs and then there are additional long-term costs. So in these tables, that third column is the amount of money that they're going to get. So you'll see it's always higher than just one council capacity grant, but it's not as high as they would have been getting when they were separate.
Okay, so getting back to the other question about whether this is you want councils to merge, there's no financial incentive for them to merge. In fact, there's a financial disincentive.
For the record, Courtney Schaff, and one of the thought processes behind all of this is if organizations are deciding to merge, there should be other reasons than besides OWEB's funding. There are reasons around board recruitment, about delivery and service to the community that they're serving, and about ability to leverage additional funding sources. So no, it's never the full or more than they got as individual organizations, but as the Rogue River Watershed Council would say, they are delivering and have higher quality board and staff than they ever did individually. And so it's not just about the OWEB money. There has to be other local reasons for a merger.
Gary, and then Debbie.
This is Gary. So we have an example of the Rogue River now, and that's the only one of merging, correct? So are they working off of this? Is these the numbers we're using for them at this current time?
For the record, Courtney Schaff, these are the numbers we will use for them with this council capacity grant award that you would take today, moving forward. So they have been eligible for the last 2 biennia to apply for a merger implementation grant of $200,000, which the board has awarded each of the last 2 biennia. Those numbers are slightly different than what you see here in the table, but moving forward, their additional council capacity merger funding would be based on these calculations.
Okay. Thanks.
And Debbie.
So for the record, Debbie Holland. So part of this conversation, as Courtney indicated, does go back a ways at this point, and part of the financial incentive for the councils at the time, and when we were first starting this conversation, the total dollar amount we had to work with was diminishing, and the council numbers were increasing. And so as each council, we were funding more and more councils, then there were less and less dollars for restoration grants. And the councils saw that too. So they saw as they continued to divide and get smaller, they were actually impacting the resources on the ground, their ability to get additional small and open capacity grants. So there's kind of two different ways to look at, is there an incentive or not? So one is the actual capacity of the organization, how much dollars are they getting for their administrative costs, et cetera. But the other side of that, which many councils were very interested in, was how much dollars were going to the ground. And so they see some advantages to being able to support mergers when, as Courtney has said, it's appropriate. It's never been the position of the board to direct mergers or request them. It's always been a voluntary option.
Great. Okay, I think, Jason Robinson, for the record, in order to keep moving forward this morning, I think we'll hold there and move forward with the next discussion. And just a clarification, Courtney, you will be coming back up during the board deliberations. So if we could hold questions on this next item until the deliberations, that'll help us move into public comment on time. Thank you.
Great. For the record, Courtney Schaff. We are now moving to agenda item L2, which is the Council Capacity Grant Awards. I want to remind folks that there are 3 letters of support in your blue folders. I will address those after public comment. And then I also just want to take a really quick minute to orient you to your staff report, because there are quite a few attachments here that I will reference. So attachment A is the map of locally recognized watershed councils. Attachment B is the overview of the merit criteria. Attachment C is the staff funding recommendation. I do want to point out one typo I found this morning in attachment C. If you look at the 3rd column in the application number, it says 218, and it should say 220, which is the number you will see in the evaluation. So I just want to point that out. And then attachment D are the evaluations for all of the councils, and I will reference numbers related to the letters of support and any public comment when I come back. But you will see the application number 210001 and so on in the top left-hand corner. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history of the council capacity grants, review the eligibility and merit criteria, and then talk about the staff funding recommendation. So one of the key things to remember, especially for some of our newer board members and some history, is watershed councils are defined in statute, and they are voluntary local organizations, and they have to be designated by a local government. OWEB does not create or oversee watershed councils. Our role is a funder, and we may provide funding to those watershed councils. The other thing to point out is there are more locally recognized watershed councils around the state than OWEB provides funding to. So there are many watershed councils that exist without council capacity funding. Those councils, just like any other organization, can apply for our project grants, such as small grants, open solicitation grants, and other funding opportunities. Again, here's the map of watershed councils, locally recognized watershed councils around the state. One of the things that I was referring to earlier is that in 2013, the OWEB board adopted a policy direction that they wanted to build council capacity through increased council sharing, combining, and collaborating, and reducing the number of individual council support grants over a 5 to 10 year period, which is where the organizational collaboration grants stemmed from. So to reinforce this direction, the board approved the beginning of the organizational collaboration grants, but also capped the number of individual watershed councils that could apply for council capacity grants. And that cap is at 64, based on the number of geographic areas and councils that had previously received, previous to 2013, council capacity grants. And the idea was to encourage councils to collaborate, to share resources, to consider shared staffing and merger opportunities moving forward. And the vision that the board adopted when we adopted the council capacity rules and guidance in 2014 was a watershed restoration system that's resilient, sustainable, and achieving ecological outcomes throughout the state. This graph demonstrates OWEB's history of funding watershed councils, and we've been providing council capacity grants at various funding levels since 1997. These grants support effective watershed councils that are engaging people and communities in their watershed and implementing projects on the ground. OWEB adopted the new rules and guidance in 2014, and this is our third cycle funding grants under those new rules. And one of the pieces of feedback I have received continuously as we've adopted the new process and implemented it, as councils really have appreciated the transparency in the process and the communication that we do throughout the course of the process. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the process here. So this was the first biennium council submitted applications through our new online application system, which was great and a lot less, a very seamless process for many of our organizations. After applications are submitted, OWEB staff do an eligibility check. We do have eligibility criteria that live in the rules. After that, we do what we call the initial merit review, and that's when all the regional program reps and myself sit down and walk through the merit criteria in each of the applications and determine whether we have any questions or concerns. After that process, we then have the secondary review process where when we do have questions or concerns for councils, instead of the process stopping there and councils receiving a funding recommendation, we bring them in and have a conversation with staff and board to see if our questions and concerns can be answered. This biennium, we had 10 councils participate in the secondary review process, and because we had a significant number coming from the east side of the state, we held one day of our secondary reviews in Pendleton, so folks didn't have to travel so far, and then we had held one day of our secondary reviews in Salem. Through the secondary review process, we also bring in external reviewers. So we have one reviewer from each region, depending on where the councils are from, and we have 2 statewide reviewers that sit in each of those 10 interviews to make sure that we have consistency across all of those 10 reviews. So those secondary reviews involve both the council staff and the board members. So after that, throughout this process, I've met and kept the operating capacity subcommittee informed. And then we come today for the board discussion and action. So as I said before, the eligibility criteria are actually in rule. The purpose of the eligibility criteria are to ensure that councils have in place best practices for operations. So there are things that we expect councils to have in their bylaws, and there are things that we expect councils to have in their policies and procedures. The eligibility review does not check on how they are implementing those bylaws and policies and procedures, but whether they have them in place. It's a presence absence check. We also have eligibility criteria around geography and size and local designation. Again, every council that is applying to OWEB has to be locally designated by a local government entity. We have 4 merit criteria that ensure accountable investment of OWEB funds. Those merit criteria around effective governance and management, progress in planning, progress in on-the-ground restoration, and progress in community engagement. One of the things that I want to point out is in progress in restoration and community engagement, we know that this doesn't look the same in every community in the state. We don't expect a certain number of projects to be happening on the ground. We don't expect or what community engagement looks like. It's going to look like differently in every community based on the number of applications someone is receiving. Sometimes councils are taking a step back and not doing a whole number of projects because maybe they're putting a more emphasis on planning or trying to figure out organizational health, but they still need to be making progress in these areas and demonstrating that they have intentions to be working on the-ground restoration and community engagement. When it comes to progress and planning, what we're looking for is that the council is acknowledging and working towards thinking about how are they doing their work? What is their niche in their community? Are they operating off of a strategic plan? Are they regularly working with stakeholders? Do they have a technical advisory committee that's giving them input on the work they're doing? That it's more than an opportunistic nature of someone walks in the door with a project and they say yes to everything, but they have a process in place to think about what are the next projects they're going to do, how do they fit in with the limiting factors that need to be addressed, and how does it complement the niche that the council's created for itself and its community, and they're delivering those services based on the local needs. And finally, governance and management, we're looking for that councils are actively managing and thinking about their bylaws, their strategic plans, their policies and procedures, and implementing those. They're managing their board, they're managing their staff, and they're being aware and cognizant of good management practices for the organization. So now I'm going to touch on the staff funding recommendation, which is described in attachment C, and I'll take a moment to walk through the funding table. So you'll see in the first column on the left is the staff funding recommendation, which is either full funding, reduced funding, or do not fund. The second column is whether the council was part of the secondary review process. As I mentioned previously, we had 10 councils this biennium that participated in the secondary review process. Of those 10, 7 are recommended for full funding, which meant through the secondary review process, they were able to answer the questions and concerns of the staff, and we felt that they did meet and demonstrated that they met all the merit criteria and should be recommended for full funding. Then you have your application number, the name of the watershed council. The next column is the merger funding. So here you'll see that the Rogue River Watershed Council is recommended for merger funding. Then you have the 1921 recommended award amount, and then for reference, the 1719 funding amount. So you'll see that we have 56 councils recommended for full funding, 1 council recommended for reduced funding, and 2 councils recommended for do not fund today. So before I talk and provide some background on the do not fund, I thought I'll just pause here to see if there's any questions up to this point.
Questions? Jamie?
Jamie McLeod-Skinner for the record, and thank you very much for that thorough review. I have a question regarding the fourth point that you just mentioned, community engagement. And it has to do with the involvement of federally recognized tribes in the discussion process. I'm especially sensitive to this given the fact that tribes are sovereign governments, that Oregon recognizes government-to-government relationships, and these are, OWEB is dispersing government funds. So how are we, how does it factor into the discussion and the review process to ensure that if the Watershed Council's geographical area includes areas where there are either federally recognized tribes have tribal land, or even areas that include lands where tribes have treaty rights? How does that factor into the conversation and the review?
For the record, Courtney Schaff. I will let you know that at this point in our merit criteria, that is not part of the consideration process. What the criteria and guidance state is we expect folks to be working with a representation of the communities within their watershed. However, I do think that is an important consideration moving forward. It was not raised by staff or those folks involved in our Rules Advisory Committee process when we were working through this years ago. We will be sometime this biennium coming to the board and asking for permission to begin a rulemaking process around council capacity grants to do some updates. And I do think that is something we should build into that process and make part of the future evaluation criteria.
Thank you very much. And I understand it was not part of the criteria for this process, but I would just, Chair, if we could footnote that for future reference. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you very much for raising that.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Okay. So I want to take a minute now, for the record, Courtney Schaff, to walk through our do not fund recommendations. And as I say every time when I come up once a biennium in front of the board and talk about council capacity funding recommendations, we do not make do not fund recommendations lightly. There has been a lot of communication amongst OWEB staff, our technical review team that provides input in this process, the operating capacity subcommittee, between MEDA and I, between our local program representatives, and I did have individual conversations with the council chairs of each of these two, three individual organizations throughout this process. OWEB has made do not fund recommendations to the board in the past. We did it for the first time in 2011-13. And again in 15-17 and 17-19. I can tell you that of our past do not fund recommendations, 3 of those councils have reapplied again in the future for council capacity grants, and at this point in time, those 3 councils are recommended for full funding in this staff report. When we make a do not fund recommendation, it is based on what we believe is inadequate performance of those watershed councils. When we talk about inadequate performance, it can mean a couple things. It can mean that they didn't meet any at all of the merit criteria. It could mean that they have demonstrated lack of progress over multiple years, and we feel like they have not demonstrated their ability to turn the corner and show a positive trajectory. And we look across all of the merit criteria. We look across our interactions with the watershed councils on all of our other funding programs, and we take into consideration the conversations that are held through the secondary review process. However, the other key point to point out is that a do not fund recommendation does not preclude these watershed councils from applying for other OWEB funding, including open solicitation and small grants and other funding programs that we offer through partners, whether it be through the NRCS Technical Assistance Grant offering or WEED grants provided by ODA. And it also does not mean that councils cannot reapply in the future for future council capacity grants. So with that, I will pause and see if there are any questions before we pause for public comment.
Barbara and then Brenda.
Barbara Boyer. So you said last biennium 17-19 there were 3 that were not funded. Did I hear that correctly?
For the record,
do not fund?
No. So last biennium we had staff recommendation was for 2 watershed councils for do not fund. One of those, the board, after considerate deliberation, for those that might remember, the board did decide to provide 1-year funding to one of those councils, and then they had to reapply halfway through that biennium and demonstrate progress, and then they did receive additional funding.
At the lower rate?
At the lower
Okay.
rate, yes.
Okay, thank you. I was just looking at the graph and it didn't match to what I thought I heard. Thank you.
Brenda?
Brenda McComb for the record. Courtney, thanks. This has been really helpful for me as a new member to understand this process. When a watershed council does not receive funding in a given year, is there anything done to help that watershed council kind of get themselves back together to be more successful in the future?
For the record, Courtney Schaff. OWEB staff, both the regional program representative and myself, regularly offer whatever assistance they seek, such it could be attending council meetings, meeting with project partners. However, I will state one of the things we think very carefully about when we make a do not fund recommendation is it also time for OWEB to take a step back from engagement with those councils, for the councils to take a moment to look internally and decide what they want to be without OWEB's funding there. Because often when councils are struggling and OWEB funding is part of the mix, the questions that I get asked are, what does OWEB want us to be? What does OWEB want us to do? What do we need to do to check the box to meet your merit criteria? And often the healthier conversation is for the board to have the conversation about what do we want to be? What does our community need us to be? Does that align with OWEB funding? Is OWEB funding the right place for us?
Other question, Alan?
Alan Henning for the record. Courtney, I don't know if now's the time, but in the evaluation, in a couple of different evaluations, the phrase is included that says not completed any progress in on-the-ground restoration projects in this biennium. What does that mean? When you think about it, watershed councils are really involved in active restoration work. Does progress mean they haven't done anything for 2 years in restoration work? Maybe they've done outreach, but nothing on the ground, no on-the-ground work?
Can you give, for the record, Courtney Chef, could you point, I hate to talk on generalities because each of these is a very specific conversation, Alan. Is there one that
Or Columbia River Watershed Council?
Okay. Thank you. For the record, Courtney Schaff. So Lower Columbia River Watershed Council was the one that staff recommended do not fund and the board provided partial funding to last year. The council took the this last biennium to do a lot of internal look, a lot of self-reflection. And in this case, that statement means that they did not do any restoration projects during this biennium. They submitted one application that wasn't funded. So they did not take any action on the ground restoration, which is why they are recommended for reduced funding. They're on the right trajectory. They're looking at the right things, but they didn't do on the ground restoration, which means they didn't meet all of our merit criteria, which means we can't recommend them for full funding.
I think that statement exists throughout, and so you'd have to dive into each evaluation
And I
to really
would
get
be
the
happy-
details. Okay.
To follow up with you.
Thanks.
Okay, I know Randy, and then what I'd like to do is move on to our public comment and then have Courtney come back up for our deliberations. Okay, perfect.
Randy Labby, co-chair for the record. We're going to move along to a comment period that is specific to Agenda L. There are 2 requests for comment. The first is Bob Jones of the Rogue River Watershed Council, who's going to speak in support of merger funding.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
This is Bob Jones. I'm, for the record, and I'm a board member of the Rogue River Watershed Council. As you know, the Rogue River Watershed Council is a result of 4 councils merging 4.5 years ago, and we've received pre-merger funding, post-merger funding, and we've worked through that process. It's been a long and difficult process. We've made great progress, and we are now accomplishing much more on the ground restoration as one entity than those 4 did combined. We have professional, specialized staff. We've completed 22 on-the-ground restoration projects, 7 more in progress, 9 more with landowner agreements. We've implemented 11 outreach events. We oversee 4 long-term monitoring efforts. We have an ED, an executive director, 2 program managers who create program and direction and develop projects. We have 1 restoration project manager and a business manager that handles admin, fiscal, and social media. And so the difference between how we're operating now, it's more of a traditional nonprofit organization than with the watershed councils. Even though they're nonprofits, many times they have a coordinator that has to do all those things. So when you think about one person doing all that work, I don't know that there's very many people in the world that has all the skill sets to do that. So the nice thing about combining and becoming a more efficient, effective entity is that we can have the staff that's capable of doing the things that need to get done. The post-merger funding has been extremely important to work through this merger process and get our organization up and running and efficiently and effectively. The Rogue River Watershed Council, as you guys have already discussed today, is receiving, even with the merger funding, is receiving less than the 4 watershed councils would have. We are leveraging much more outside support and funding through partnerships. So we have 2 partnerships that we've developed to where we're getting annual funding with the Soil and Water and the Medford Water Commission. In addition to that, we're receiving funding from BLM, Four-Way Foundation, City of Grants Pass, the Rogue Steelheaders, Resource Legacy Fund, Rogue Basin Partnership, Wild Salmon Center, U.S. Forest Service, City of Eagle Point, just to give you an example. So previous to this, with the 4 watershed councils, they did not have partnerships developed. They did not have quite the extent of developing those other resources. We're working on, and we've grown our membership and our donor base. Again, the other 4 councils really didn't have much of a donor base at all. We currently have an annual fundraiser. We'll have our 3rd annual Celebrate the Rogue event this year, and you're welcome to attend. That's on October 26th. We'd love to have you. And although we've made great progress, we cannot completely backfill the loss of the funding. So continued merger funding is extremely important to keep us whole, keep us going. And whole maybe is the wrong word because as you know, there's less funding than you would with the 4. But I still think we totally feel that this is much better because we're actually getting a lot more done on the ground. We are glad that OWEB and board staff have recognized the need for continued merger funding, and hopefully you'll continue to support this. And so I'm here for questions.
Thank you. Mary, did you want to?
Yeah, just a comment, and I'll see if there are any questions first.
Any questions for Bob? Paul.
Thank you. Paul Henson. I'm curious, and I'll probably ask Courtney this when she comes back up too, maybe in a different context, but this issue of right sizing, kind of watershed councils, you know, too big, too small. I'm curious if you could give maybe one example of you know, the sort of benefit of that right sizing from your perspective, maybe, you know, just, you know, more communication, that kind of thing. And then maybe one of the downsides, like you're covering a bigger geographic area, people have to travel further to meet, communicate, those kinds of things. Is there a pro and a con that stand out in this kind of right sizing exercise?
Right sizing. Well, I don't know if there really is a right size. That's really going to come down to the area. But I think that this size, the area that we're covering, which is about half of the Rogue Basin, is a good size to cover as long as you've got the funding and the staff to do that. And really, that's really what it comes down to. And as far as the last part, I'm not really sure. I mean, that's a tough one to answer. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I just want to, while Bob is here, give a shout out to both Bob and Courtney. This concept wouldn't have happened without Bob's encouragement. When he was with the Medford Water Commission, was working with all of those groups and saw what the potential was for these to merge. So I give Bob a lot of credit. 2 other things I just want to call out about this. So they were the first to merge, and they have done presentations in many places along with their outside contractor who helped them go through the process. And so they have done a really good job. People wonder, you know, are we telling people the story? Bob, Courtney, and others have done an amazing job of telling the story, and people have to decide for themselves if it's right. And there are places that it isn't, and there are places that it is. The other thing I just want to mention and put a flag in from a strategic planning perspective, what we're talking about in this merger funding is actually what I would put in the bold and innovative actions category. Courtney did a bunch of research, Bob as well, so they pushed us and said, you can't take us back to one council at the end of this. So it was these guys who said, here's why it matters. And Courtney went searching all over the country to try and find folks who did this, and I think will be the first. So this is an area where you as a board are leading the way in what it takes to help support these groups. After you tell them to do something, you can't just drop them. So huge kudos to both Bob and Courtney because they've been incredibly thoughtful and helped us through all of this process. So thanks, Bob.
Right, thank you.
Bruce, you have a question?
Yeah, Bob, it sounds like things are going well, and I am curious when you talked about the staffing of the combined merged council, how does that compare to the staffing of the 4 previous councils?
Okay, the 4 previous councils had a total of 2.75 FTEs.
Total?
Total. They didn't even have they did not have full-time. 2 of them had full-time coordinators, the other ones had part-time.
Thanks.
So it's quite a difference.
Yeah, Alan?
Alan Henning for the record. Bob, when you shared with us the numbers of projects that you've been able to get out as a combined entity, did you compare that with something like in the past period? If you looked at the 4 years that you all have merged and total the number of projects, did you go back maybe 4 years and total the number of projects that the 4 of the entities did individually to compare them that way to come up with the summary that you've done a lot more?
We did look back at that. I don't remember those numbers, but I know it was a lot less because I actually served on 2 of those watershed councils, and I know that sometimes we'd be lucky to get 1 or 2 done a year, or we had one that went on for like 10 years, one project. It was just, so it was just a long process because it had complicated problems. So I know that we're doing a lot more. I can't. I can get you those numbers, though.
That would be good to have those numbers because obviously there's big benefits you guys are reaping from the merger, and so being able to have those numbers and show them really helps tell the whole story.
I know that quite often those councils would apply for grants with OWEB and they were unsuccessful many times, and we've been a lot more successful with OWEB and other entities as far as actually receiving the grants because of developing the projects more completely better, good grant writers, they have exceptional skills, and so it's made a big difference on the actual success of getting the funds to do the projects.
Bob, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the board for taking the time to be here today and testify. We have a number of new board members on the OWEB board, and your testimony has been very valuable for us.
Okay, thank you. And one last thing I'll say is that I would love this board to have a vision of reducing the number of councils in the state of Oregon down to 30 to 45. And I know that you guys don't want to push people to do that, and that's not maybe where you're going, but I think if we get less councils, if we get merged, and the collaboration is great to a point, but when you're still sharing resources, there's all this coordination that goes on, and it's not as effective as actually creating a new organization. And even though that takes time to get it up and running, once it is up and running, it's easier to do. And so I'd love to see a vision of getting down to 30 to 45 councils, because as councils merge like we merged, that made more funding available for the other councils, because the funding that we were not receiving got divided up between the other councils. So there is an incentive not to merge, because if you just sit there and wait it out, you're getting a little more funding. It's not much. It's not much, but there is that. So it'd be great to see us get, and I think we'd accomplish a lot more if we get to that point. Thank you.
Thank you. The next testimony will be by Ken Byerly from the Glen Gibson Watershed Council, Glen Gibson Creek Watershed Council, and the Rick Wall Watershed Council, speaking to the capacity awards. Thanks for being here, Ken.
Thank you very much. For the record, Ken Byerly, concerning grant application number 220032. Thank you for the opportunity to provide input on your proposed decisions. On the way down yesterday, I was listening to one of my favorite folk singers, cowboy folk singers, Tom Russell. And the lyrics of one song kind of spoke to me when he saying there's a time for sober introspection and there's a time to cut the wild dogs loose. So you're posed to make a significant decision affecting some 60 groups from around the state who are separate, independent advocates for watershed restoration and improvement. That's huge. There are very few states where that occurs. And the Glen Gibson Creek Watershed and Rick Riel Watershed Councils are one of two that are not recommended for funding. The councils have submitted a joint letter, which you have in your packet. I'm not going to read that. I presume that you've read it. There are a couple of arguments in there that I think are important, at least to us. And we describe how we believe that the evaluation missed significant information. We've provided that information in this response, and think that it's worth considering. So I hope that the arguments made and the evidence supplied will help you in your deliberations. Our greatest surprise was that the councils have recognized that we have weaknesses, and in our application for council capacity grant, we recognize that. We have been working on that grant, and admittedly, while not all council members were enthusiastic about it, the council capacity grant application, through the work with Solid Ground Consultants, even the skeptical have seen significant value in the information and organizational capacity information that's been provided to us. And we've made significant changes in regard to that, in response to it. We've made changes based on their early input, and that's articulated in the letter that we've sent. And that grant is still ongoing. So our confusion and struggle with this is that while we were awarded a grant to try to address issues of organizational capacity, that has not been completed. We're still in the middle of that. We have meetings with both councils and the consultants on Friday of this week. And it seems illogical to eliminate council capacity funding while we're still ongoing looking at the efforts and building the tools to build on our weaknesses. So to summarize, we feel that the review failed to recognize changes made both in effective governance and management and progress in planning. That we provided a strategic plan that was adopted fairly recently that we've been working on for some 9 months. We believe that we've provided evidence of progress in both areas that showed weakness and was not acknowledged in the review. So this is my sober, introspective approach. And your conclusion, is that, and our conclusion is that the recommendation is unwarranted and that the board should provide funding for council capacity for grant application 220-032. Our situation is also, I think it's important to understand that our situation where there are two councils under a single grant is not part of the merger conversation. We have, whether we merge or not is irrelevant because we are required to apply under a single grant application regardless, because that's how we've been in the past. The other thing that I think is important, if you look at the materials we provided, there's a history of decisions about funding in the Mid-Willamette Valley. These are the west side applications from Luckemute, Glen Gibson, Rick Riel, and there was a forced merger by the board in the 2003-2005 when Rick Riel and Luckemute applied separately. They were told they would have a single grant for both of them in the 2003-2005 biennium. And I also think if you look at the last couple of the argument that we made about policy concerns in the letter to joint letter, where there are other models for how to approach council capacity that I think are important to think about. You've got more of a stick approach than a carrot approach. The council capacity grants is a start in a carrot approach. But if you look at what's happened through the Willamette Initiative, where Meyer has understood that it takes time to build capacity, I think there's a better model than what you've got. Anyway, I see the red light flashing. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions for Ken from the board. Jason?
For the record, Jason Robinson. Thank you, Ken, for that update. Two questions. The first is, as I look through the packet of information, the materials we got from the letters of support for this, and then listened to your testimony this morning, and I appreciate that. You know, I think the decision that staff have to come to for a do not fund recommendation is a challenging one, and obviously there's a lot of work that goes into that. One of the things I see in the information here and potentially pick up from your testimony is that there's some information that may or may not have exchanged between OWEB staff, and maybe there's other things going on within the Watershed Council that staff weren't aware of based on this. However, I just want to get some clarification on that, because I know it is it's a scrutinized process to get to this type of recommendation.
And I think the only response I have to that is that there does appear to be a failure to communicate, and the failure is probably on both sides. I'm sure that, you know, while we submit our minutes to the council meetings to the staff, whether they're read or not is a different question, and whether they pick up the fact that we were working on a strategic plan update, I don't know how that's perceived. We didn't reach out and say, here's what we're doing. And we may not have raised that during, I don't recall any question about that at the time of the second interview. So I'm not sure where the failure lies. I'm sure there's significant failure on our side as well as their side.
Okay, thanks.
Gary? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Just one quick follow-up to that, Jason Robinson, for the record. And so in this particular case where we're looking at considering a do not fund recommendation, how does that impact the council's ability to move forward this year, knowing that you can respond and come back for future funding cycles, still have the opportunity to seek out open solicitation and other funding sources?
I think we concluded our letter, the joint letter, by stating that we will continue to work forward regardless of funding opportunities. We found that simply the recommendation not to fund has stimulated activity already. So it's an interesting hope, but it will limit our capability. We've lost our coordinator already, found a real job. So we're struggling with that, but we will continue as independent organizations.
Thanks, Ken.
Gary.
Mr. Gary, Ken, how old are the Rick Earl, Glenn Gibson Watershed Councils? When were they formed?
Ken Beerley, for the record, I believe in the mid-'90s. I think Glenn Gibson was formed in 95, 96 timeframe, and Rick Rial was about the same timeframe.
Been working quite a while then.
A little bit.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions from the board? Yes. Jamie.
Jamie McLeod-Skinner for the record. Thank you so much for being here. And just wanted to, an observation from your comments. I think the board, I'm new to the board, but I know the board challenges staff to safeguard funds and be super careful with funds. So I appreciate that in this process. You've said there's there may have been some information that was not heard, but I appreciate the fact that they did their job in bringing this conversation forward. So thank you for coming before the board to further the conversation, provide additional information. I have two questions I wanted to ask. It looks like from review of your application that there was a similar challenge and a similar discussion in the previous biennium, the 2015 through 2017. And so I'm just curious as to what work, it sounds like you've done a lot of work in the past few months, the past few weeks to really prepare for this discussion. What work took place as part of effective governance and management in the previous biennium that maybe you feel might have been missed in this review process? And the second is one of the criteria that I've heard presented was it's not so much what OWEB staff ask you to do, it's more of what the community and your constituents, as it were, asks you to bring forward and kind of challenges you to do. So if you could talk to us a little bit about the outreach work you've done within your community and the feedback you've received, not so much from OWEB staff, but specifically from folks within your watershed area.
Thank you for the question. For the record, Ken Beerley again. What we've done, we have struggled with the limited amount of funding to have a coordinator that works on two separate councils, but also has to do something else to have a full position. We started out with a shared position with the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. They had an election. A new chair of the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District had no desire to help out with watershed councils, said thank you very much, but we're terminating the contract. We worked to get a common employer of record, the Cascade Pacific RC&D. And so our efforts have been trying to kind of deal with these crises that happened. So that position was to be a coordinator for the two councils, and then he was also the regional weed manager for Cascade Pacific. So we had a part-time staff person divided into three pieces and raising a young family. I don't blame him for finding a real job. So we've struggled with trying to figure out how, under those circumstances, we can provide guidance to the coordinator, which is what one of our big concerns is. And then because they were hired by someone else under the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District, they were recruited and hired by Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. They had oversight authority on their work and their activities. We, the two chairs of the Watershed Council, collaborated with the district manager at the time to try to provide oversight, but they were the employer of record. They were the ones who directed their work and set their priorities, and we tried to influence that. But that's not an ideal situation. Let's just put it that way. As far as outreach to the community, our council has a very strong working relationship with the City of Salem. The City of Salem lays in the middle of the watershed. There's agricultural land in the lower part of the watershed. There's agricultural land in the upper part of the watershed. And what we've had a very effective relationship with them. In fact, I got out of a work party that was getting rid of ivy off trees in a state park that's between the two watershed councils just yesterday, where we had the Grand Ronde Tribe youth crew out there pulling ivy off trees and basically doing work within the community it's basically a neglected state park. And State Parks was there. The watershed councils were there, the tribe was there. So we were pretty pleased about that work. We're able to kind of knock out 10 acres of ivy in the trees where it spreads by birds. Anyway, so we feel that we have a strong relationship with the local community, and we're trying to build on that. We are partially supported by what's called the Habitat Improvement Fund, where the local utility, Salem Electric, has what's called the Habitat Improvement Fund, who provides funds by donation by their clients, and it goes into a fund that goes to the Watershed Council to do projects, and we use those funds in the local community.
Thank you. Alan?
Alan Henning for the record. Ken, how many projects does the Watershed Council have ongoing right now?
Probably 4 or 5.
Is that boots in the field, restoration projects, or outreach projects?
We've been doing riparian restoration, primarily along some of the tributary streams within the urban context. We've been doing exotic species removal. We've been doing, as I was just mentioning, we've been involved in pollinator gardens And we've got a relationship with the city parks to do pollinator gardens throughout the city park system in this in Salem. And let's see, we've got a 14-acre Oak Savanna project that we've started many years ago, but are still stewarding to make sure that that savanna is providing habitat benefits within the urban context. So a couple of things we're up to.
So the funding here says to support Watershed Council coordinator. Maybe I misunderstood you. Did your coordinator recently resign to take a different job, and are you absent a coordinator?
Correct.
Okay. And so the responsibility of managing that coordinator switched from the SWCD to
Cascade Pacific RC&D.
How is that going to improve things?
Well, it was a less hostile relationship. It was still the same kind of arrangement where there was an arm's length relationship between the employer and the group that was providing funds. So the current grant for council capacity is with Cascade Pacific RC&D, or was. So it's a way, we've struggled with how do you hire somebody and how do you find an employer of record that can work for two different councils with insufficient funds for a full-time position. That's the basic conundrum we wrestle with.
I'm struggling with, I hate to see councils not funded at all, but the track record isn't very pretty, knowing that you've been on probation for a couple of biennium already. And I'm not opposed to supporting another period of probation if, in fact, there's thought that there's going to be progress being made to make sure that you get on track, to make sure that the elements get into place. But I'm also wondering whether or not just the inherent structure of the two councils and the way they were established, back in 2005, 6, 7, whenever you mentioned that, is a deterrent to success for one or the other.
There's no question that the current arrangement is not a design for success. And we're starting to recognize that, and that's what the council capacity grant has helped us to understand. And we're working through right now trying to build a collaboration model that looks at it differently, how we can work together in a different manner that would be more efficient for both supervision of the whatever staff may be available and accomplishing the outcomes that we can. Along with that, we're working with solid ground consultants to generate tools that will help us build board capacity, strengthen our board structure, be more deliberate about how we select board members and engage board members. So we're building those tools. The council capacity grant has been hugely valuable in helping us identify what the tools are. We're in the midst of that, and we're trying to build those tools so that we can look at a different organization in the future. And we don't know what that organization is at this point in time.
So it sounds like you're further ahead than what you were last year, but you're way behind when you look at your peer group watersheds in doing what you need to do.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, let's time for one more question here. Barbara.
Barbara Boyer. Ken, you've mentioned Solid Ground Consulting. When did they come in to assist you guys? When did they start?
Oh, Lord. To be honest, I can't recall, but I think it was around the 1st of this year, and we didn't really get started. Okay, 1st of this year, January 19, 2019. But we really didn't get started until fairly, scheduling different groups is not always easy, but we now have a pretty good structure, and they're building tools. They're helping us build tools.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ken, for being here and then giving us insights as to your issues.
Thank you.
Great. For the record, Jason Robinson, I'm going to ask Courtney to come back up, and we'll start our board deliberations. What I'd like to propose to the board is that we break these down, kind of streamline our discussions into 3 different talking points. So the first being the merger and take action upon the merger. Then talk about the recommendations for funding. So those items that are recommended for funding all the way down to 2018-02, which is the Lower Columbia River. And then third, look at those items that are not recommended for funding. Does that process seem good? Okay, so let's start with the merger funding discussion. Randy.
I'm prepared to make a motion subject to more discussion.
Alan, question?
Alan Henning for the record. I think Bob, in his testimony this morning, provide really good input on the importance of the merger funding. And when you look at the tables, the numbers on the table, and Stephen brought this out, merging, there's not an incentive, a financial incentive to merge, but there are other incentives for merging that, again, Bob did bring out. I think the merger money, for no better way of putting it, is critical to show how these mergers can be successful, help get them down the road, and see where we go. It seems like a logical way to go, and when you look at the numbers, merging councils do lose money, and the merger monies help offset that loss. So I fully support that.
Other questions on the merger funding? Okay, Randy?
Randy Labby for the record, co-chair. I move the board adopt the guidance for merger funding as described in attachment A to the staff report.
I have a motion by Randy. Do I have a second? Second by Gary. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. So now I'd like to move on to those items that are recommended for funding, and those would be those that are recommended for full or partial funding, as I mentioned, all the way down to the Lower Columbia River Watershed Council, item 218-002. So any discussion on those items? Okay. So let's move into discussion on item 218-007 and 220-032, those that are not recommended for funding. Molly.
Molly Kyle for the record. I appreciate all of the conversation and discussion around the issue. My question is, I'm also still getting used to the funding portfolio, is if those 2 councils are not recommended for funding, what is the path within the grant mechanisms that you have in the capacity building grant for them to come back up to speed?
For the record, Courtney Schaff. So if we do a do not fund for these 2 watershed councils, they would not receive a capacity grant for this biennium. They are continue to be eligible to apply for other grants, including small grants and open solicitation grants. I don't have in front of me the number of open grants either of those have. I know the Tillamook Bay Watershed Council has not been successful in recent applications. However, they are part of the Salmon Superhighway program and are getting some project management funding through that program. Similar to the Rick Reel Glenn Gibson, the Tillamook Bay Watershed Council coordinator has recently resigned from that position. So both organizations are without a coordinator currently. And so their path forward is the path forward that those board members that are active within those councils decide.
One quick comment here, Courtney, or a question. This is Jason Robinson for the record. So you had talked about some success stories for those councils that were not recommended for funding in the past and where they've changed things and come on. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, some of those paths that they took for success?
Yes, for the record, Courtney Schaff. I would say the common theme for all of them was a moment of, I would say, stepping away by board members, becoming fairly small. And then a series of conversations with OWEB staff and community members about what do we want here, what kind of, and typically one or two people within the community decided that we really want a watershed council here. This is something that we need, and started bringing together a coalition. Often there's other either state or federal partners that have, land base within that community that really will spearhead, hey, we want to get projects done and help with initial, project design to get momentum behind a project. Because we all, if many of you have ever been involved in a nonprofit, the governance stuff isn't really fun. Folks want to do the projects. And so usually the groups kind of re-energize around a project or two and then refocus on governance and come back together and grow a new, usually fully new boards. No one is a leftover from the old boards because they've really had to refine new energy and find a new path forward. So it's very locally driven work of reforming a council.
Other questions, Molly?
Kind of a follow-up to this. What are the consultation services that are available to communities and that are finding their path? What does OWEB support just as consultation services?
For the record, Courtney Schaff, in each of these situations, the local regional program rep and myself would be and always are available for phone calls, attending watershed councils. And so for the ones that were previous do not funds, when requested, either the local program rep or I would go back and talk through process and help, or often referring them to the network of Oregon watershed councils or other folks that can provide assistance, referring them to other local watershed councils that are successful for support.
And may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Maida Lofsgarden, for the record. I also want to just key in on a point that Courtney made earlier before the public comment, and that is there's also a little bit of a cautionary note because we have to be really careful that they're not trying to reform themselves in what they think might meet OWEB's needs. Mm-hmm. And so as Courtney said, we're there if asked, but we also don't pre-insert ourselves. And the network of Oregon Watershed Councils has really been a good additional resource for them to consider. I also would mention we've had conversations with the community of Tillamook about potentially looking at something like an organizational collaboration grant. There are a number of strong organizations that sit in that watershed, and there might be ways for them to have conversations. So in addition to, as Courtney said, stakeholder engagement and other grants that these guys can apply for, there is that organizational collaboration grant. As Ken mentioned, the Rick Riel Glenn Gibson has one currently. There is actually funding sitting in that grant for them. So there are other mechanisms, but we have learned to be really cautious because we don't want them to form to what they perceive OWEB wants them to be. We want them to be what they need to be in their community.
Okay, great. I had Meg and then Debbie.
Thank you. Meg Reeves, for the record. Courtney, I wondered about, so that this applicant, it looks like, has met 2 of the 4 criteria. They had problems with the organizational parts. How significant in your thinking was the fact that they did not produce yet on the organizational, what was that category? Organizational collaboration grant?
For the record, Courtney Schaff. So there's a couple things I'll touch on there. The first part, I want to clarify Ken's terminology he was using during his public comment. When he was talking about their council capacity grant, he was referring to an organizational collaboration grant that they were awarded, which still has about $30,000 left in it, which is paying for solid ground consulting to work with the council. So when staff came to the do not fund recommendation for the Rick Riel Glenn Gibson Watershed Council, we were very cognizant of the fact that this is an organization that is meeting several of our merit criteria. But what I want to emphasize is actually what Ken was commenting on during his public comment, is that the same concerns that OWEB staff recognized in 15-17 and 17-19 still exist today. In addition, through their work with Solid Ground Consulting, so I have read all the materials and the notes that have come through this process. The independent analysis completed of each individual Rick Reel and Glenn Gibson by Solid Ground Consulting raised the exact same concerns that staff have raised in 15-17 and 17-19. So I do recognize both councils have made progress in the last few months on some planning and governance individually, not collectively. And throughout the course from 15-17, one of our concerns is their inefficient structure and how they are working together to manage their resources to implement projects on the ground and coordinate a shared coordinator. So they still don't have any progress on how they are dealing with a complex structure of two organizations and an additional third organization that is an employer, and how they're going to manage a coordinator. When we met through the secondary review process, we were aware that they are making progress on strategic planning and that they have been making progress on setting some board development goals individually, again, not collectively. But we also saw two organizations that have been aware of the concerns all the way back since 15-17 and are still engaging in the same manner that they did when we sit in the room with them back in 15-17, where there's no shared vision of where individually these councils are going to end up. There's no shared vision of where they're going to end up collectively, and there's no vision of how they are going to manage a coordinator collectively if they were to receive funding and go out and hire one. I do believe this is one of the instances when it's time for OWEB to take a step back from involvement and give these councils the space to figure out what they want to be. We aren't going to take away their organizational collaboration grant. They have funding left to continue to work with Solid Ground Consulting, but they need to decide what they want to be.
Okay, Debbie.
For the record, Debbie Holland. So that conversation that you just started, Courtney, is really where my question was. It feels like there's some dissonance between the two organizations, and so I'm interested in that history that Ken referenced around forced mergers back as far as 2003 or something like that, and if we were to proceed down the do not fund, and through this organization collaboration grant, they determined that they needed to really be separate organizations, could they come back to us as two councils and apply for individual capacity grants? It's not clear to me kind of where that history came from or how that might play into the future if they are not funded this biennium.
For the record, Courtney Schaff. So yes, there is a long history which we fully acknowledge through working with these two councils. So way back when, Rick Reel was actually the first of the council to receive individual funding in 99-01, and then similar to the board decision in 2013, there was a board decision that they wanted to have councils combine, have fewer individual grants. That's when there was a lot less funding available within the council support funding. So, as Ken said, Lucky Mute and Rick Reel and Gibson applied separately. The board made the conscious decision to award one grant to those three organizations. Jump forward a few years, the board implemented a process where they allowed councils to petition to separate. So in one biennium, there were petitions that were given to the board for councils to separate. The Lucky Mute was allowed to separate. Rick Reel and Glenn Gibson were told to stay together. There was a concern about the size, the collective size of the geography, and they felt like their two watersheds were not that distinctly different to warrant two separate council capacity grants. So they are together because of a funding decision made by OWEB. However, that decision was made all the way back in 2003, 2005. So it's a long time ago, and they have received one grant since then. So now to go forward, what were to happen in the future, to address your question, because of the policy decision adopted by the board in 2013, these councils cannot individually apply for council capacity funding. We have made the decision, the board adopted the policy decision in 2013 to not allow groups to get smaller. So There are other options that they can explore. They can look for different partners. They can look at adjacent watersheds. They could go their separate ways and look for other organizations to partner with, potentially collaborate, can potentially merge with. Those are decisions that we can help them through organizational collaboration grants and through consultations, but those are decisions that they would have to make individually.
Great. Other questions? Paul?
Paul Henson. I don't really have so much a question, sort of a comment, I guess, or an observation. It in part flows from some of the question I asked Phil Chang yesterday about forest collaboratives, and I see this in watershed councils. I actually was participated in the Tillamook Bay Watershed Councils in the mid-90s when it first was forming after the Northwest Forest Plan, and under the Forest Plan there were these watershed councils that were beginning to coalesce, and just getting those folks in the room together was an amazing accomplishment back then. And then there's that ebb and flow that Phil talked about yesterday, and the phenomenon's obviously the same in watershed councils and some other partnerships like our sage-grouse work out in Harney County. And so I guess I'm concerned, especially with Tillamook, given that we're doing, us and NOAA are doing this HCP process in that same area, and it's going to be really hard without heavy partnerships that are really functioning well. So I want to put that on the table as just a sort of reminder of something to work on. And that leads to my kind of comment, which I think Jamie queued up in the Lower Columbia thing, is what, and Molly also hit at, what is truly a process for bringing watershed councils that are in the sort of ebb rather than the flow stage, and what are some, clearly there needs to be accountability, and I really appreciate and respect the hard work the staff are doing on this. It's really impressive, but at the same time, how much, Ken mentioned carrot and stick, and how, when does the stick become too big or hard that, you start losing these good people who are trying to work and volunteer a lot of their personal time in watershed councils. So when do you intervene, and what are some ideas, brainstorming-wise? I like the idea of the sort of network of watershed councils maybe helping out, and maybe even more specifically, could high-performing, whatever that means, watershed councils members like a leader or a community member come and help and advise other watershed councils, maybe that, just come in as a kind of advisor and not a check the box sort of person, but more like, this is what I see here, this is what we went through 5 years ago in my watershed 20 miles to the south. So I just throw that out there as an observation. And this is a really difficult challenge. I really do appreciate the work you guys doing, but I also tremendously appreciate the Watershed Council individuals reading these letters and stuff. These are good, dedicated people, and we want to, figure something out with them.
Great. Maida?
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I'm going to just key up a statement, and then I'm punting this over to Courtney. One thing I want to call out, because Ken's right, it's all carrot because it's funding. The stick is, right, who gets it and who doesn't. We don't have a regulatory stick, as Courtney said. We don't decide whether councils exist or don't exist. We don't decide whether they can apply for our other funding or not. But one of the things that did happen a number of years ago, and I'm looking back at the Legislative Fiscal Office staff that's sitting in the back of the room here, we actually had a budget note on OWEB's budget for a certain period of time. Debbie, I think Alan probably remembers this as well, because there was real concern about a state granting agency providing funding to local organizations who did not have capacity to receive those funds. And so we had a budget note where the legislature told us, you need to figure out how to fix this. This is not functioning the way that it is. Into that went a 4-year process that Courtney can speak to that got us to this set of merit criteria that we have. So there's a reason these criteria exist, because the legislature looked over our shoulder and said, hey, you have to have a little bit of a stick with your funding. This funding just can't go across to everybody. So that's one piece I want Courtney to just speak to a little bit. The other piece, Courtney, I'd like you to speak to is this question about the reduced funding. We are now at one council that has reduced funding. The others who were in that category before have actually moved up to full funding. And so the other thing I just want to encourage us to think about is having these criteria and having some base in that is actually helping float those boats higher. And so I believe actually that our ebb and flow with councils is less ebb. We are seeing councils lifted by this criteria that took 4.5 years to establish. So Courtney, if you'd speak to those two.
For the record, Courtney Schaff. I'll touch on the second point first. It's fascinating to me the conversations I get to have with council board members. And when we adopted the eligibility and merit criteria, there was you are top down telling us how to run our organizations. You're not allowed to do that. You can just give us funding. Then shoot ahead a few years, I've had so many board members and council coordinators saying, I am so thankful for your eligibility and merit criteria. It forced us to have these difficult conversations that our board members were ignoring for years because they just wanted to talk about projects. And we now have something to fall back on. OWEB says we have to hold our elections. You can't tell me you don't want to. OWEB says that we have to be looking at our bylaws and having a planning process. You can't tell us you don't want to. And so there is a recognition that and appreciation that we as a funder are setting a bar, and it's a continuous improvement, and that they have to be working hard, and there's space to talk about challenges and trips and falls, but it's clear, it's written down what they have to do, and coordinators and board chairs can go back and say, we have to do this. And as Maida said, the staff funding recommendation speaks for itself. People are doing this work because it's clear and we're transparent and we're doing it. To the budget note, we did take 4 years and lots of public comment and lots of work groups to set these eligibility and merit criteria. Again, because there was a concern that we weren't clear and we weren't transparent, and everybody was getting funding and more were coming on the landscape, and we didn't have any bar that people were meeting. It was just kind of an expectation that if you applied, you got funding, very few questions asked. So through this process, I do believe we have more watershed councils that have identified their niche, are working collaboratively within our communities, and are delivering to their communities and on-the-ground restoration in the manner that we expect and should expect, considering the amount of state funding we are investing in them.
Great, thanks, Courtney. I have Brenda, and then Gary, and then I'd like to entertain a motion on this action item.
Yeah, just an observation. I think what I'm hearing on the accountability side makes perfect sense, and fully support that. And I don't think that that's inconsistent with a separate communication to struggling watershed councils, that these are some things that you should think about, right? And it probably isn't appropriate for OWEB to intervene at that point. But who can help? Where does the consultation lie? I think Molly raised that, Paul raised that, Jamie raised that. I tried to earlier. I think there needs to be kind of a three-legged stool here, if you will, right? There's the funding piece, there's the accountability piece, and then there's the support piece. And I don't know where that support piece comes from. It may not be OWEB, but I think the struggling watershed councils need to recognize that there are these places they can go to try to figure out a path forward.
Thanks, Brenda. Gary?
This is Gary, just a comment. I'm hearing around here that this is a difficult thing for a watershed council to be facing right now, but I don't see it as a life and death issue for them. I see it more as an opportunity to make some adjustments and come out the other end better. And there's examples of high functioning groups all around, and so there's some help, and so I see it as an opportunity for them.
Great. So at this time, I will entertain a motion. Randy?
Randy Labby for the record. I move the board award council capacity grants as described in attachment C to the staff report, with the added requirement that all grant numbers be preceded by 220.
All right, have a motion by Randy. Do I have a second? Brenda? Second by Brenda. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Okay, Randy Labby for the record. We have a break now for 15 minutes, so please be back here at 10 o'clock, at which time we'll take up Agenda Item M, Rogue Forest Focused Investment Partnerships.
I'll try. Put a mic on that. Gavel. Couldn't think of the word.
We need to reconvene. We're going to move along. This is Randy Labby for the record. We're going to move to item M in your book and on the agenda, and it's the Rogue Forest FIP, request for geography change, and Eric Hartstein is going to lead us.
Good morning, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Eric Hartstein, Senior Policy Coordinator, and we are on agenda item M. The item is a request to change the geography of the Rogue Forest Restoration Initiative FIP. The Rogue Forest FIP was selected by the board at the January 2019 meeting for the 2019-2021 biennium, and at this meeting, actually yesterday, was awarded funding for the biennium as part of this spending plan agenda item. So as a part of the initiative application, the Rogue Forest Partnership proposed dry forest restoration across 5 project areas, including the Upper and Middle Applegate, Briggs, Salt Creek, and Pickett West areas. And also included is the Stella project area, but likely only community engagement at this point. So the total OWEB funded acreage of these restoration treatments is 6,150 acres. You can see here on the map the project areas are sort of that hatch marked polygon shapes. So this spring, the Rogue Forest FIP partners informed OWEB staff that they were interested in removing the Pickett West project area from the FIP and replacing it with the Williams project area. And attachment A to the staff report provides detailed rationale for that request. But essentially, the partners believe that the potential for NEPA issues in the Pickett West project area might lead to some implementation delays. And you see in the map, there's a red circle, and that's the action acres that they were intending to work in the Pickett West area. And the black circle is where they are proposing to do work in the Williams project area. So this is a little clearer map of what is proposed. Again, you see the hatch marked polygons with the Pickett West project area swapped out for the Williams. And it's really important to highlight that the total acreage set for forest restoration funded through the OWEB FIP remains at 6,150 acres with this request. The Williams project area is also really attractive to the partners in that NRCS is investing in private lands in this area, and that while the cost per acre to treat in the Williams is higher than in Pickett West, that the partners have obtained additional match through the Bureau of Land Management to treat the same amount of acreage. Through the planning efforts by the partners, the partnership has quantified how different project areas rank by way of wildfire risk, climate and forest resiliency, and northern spotted owl habitat. And the Williams ranks out higher than Pickett West when it comes to reducing wildfire risk for northern spotted owl habitat, but slightly less at reducing wildfire risk to local communities. And while it's OWEB's directive to conserve and restore fish and wildlife habitat, in consulting with the project partners, I do think it's important to highlight that the upper and middle Applegate project areas rank out amongst the highest when it comes to reducing wildfire risk to communities. And so, as this table shows, the majority of the proposed forest restoration work remains in the upper Applegate. They're proposing 3,700 acres for OWEB funding. The analysis acres here, that column, that's through their planning process and includes sort of the total cumulative impacts by the proposed treatments. The footprint acres are the proposed federal treatment area, and then the conservation acres include both federal and private acres, and that is what the OWEB funding would be used for. So Williams is at the same conservation acres, 1,190, as was proposed in Pickett West, although there is a reduction in the amount of the analysis acres, as the federal footprint for Pickett West was 24,000 acres, and Williams is 6,625. So with that, I will stop and see if there are any questions.
Okay, questions for Eric on this item? Alan?
Alan Henning for the record. Eric, did the federal agencies give you any more information regarding their suggestion to change because of delay in the EIS? What was it that delay or potentially could delay the EIS when they would go with a Pickett property, for no better way of putting it?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. For the record, so the NEPA issue in the Pickett West was around a formal protest that was filed around the project, and it's a large project area. And as it applies to the proposed action acres, the protest was around maintenance fuel treatments. And so, talking with the partners, they said that the other selected project areas actually have either NEPA complete or are very, very close to having NEPA complete.
Thanks.
Additional questions? Okay. I'd like to ask for a motion.
Jason Robinson for the record. I move the board approve the proposed geographic change for the Rogue Forest Restoration Initiative Focused Investment Partnership as described in Attachment A to the staff report.
Is there a second? Seconded by Jamie, forwarded by Jason. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you. Thanks, Eric.
All right, so we're going to be moving to agenda item N, which is the OWEB board subcommittee structure. And we'll have Renee, Eric, and Courtney helping to facilitate this discussion.
So, for the record, Eric Hartstein. So this agenda item N. This will be hopefully a pretty fun exercise. We're going to be looking at the OWEB board subcommittee structure. So I think after we do a real brief intro on this, we'll actually be cutting the microphones so we can engage in a little more formal or informal discussion. And you've probably noticed the blue wall that we've constructed over on the side. We'll be using that, and hopefully our intricate taping job that Deputy Director Davis and I have utilized will hold. So the current OWEB board subcommittee structure includes subcommittees basically built around OWEB's grant programs. We have the open solicitation subcommittee, the operating capacity subcommittee, focused investments, monitoring, acquisitions, and the executive committee, which is the chairs and co-chairs of the other committees and is in charge of policy and program areas. So what we're proposing to do today is to go through what the current subcommittee structure and ask you, who are participating on these subcommittees, what are some of those attributes of the current structure that you like and you think really provide value? Also, we're going to ask if there's things of the current structure that you feel don't provide as much value. We'll ask both the board members and also the assembled managers at the table here to reflect on both the positive and the less positive attributes of the current subcommittee structure, as well as bringing in your experiences from other subcommittees that you may be a part of, other boards, commissions, or other groups. So we're going to have that written down, have both the pros and the cons, and then we'll just ask the question, should the OWEB board have subcommittees? And then if yes, should the subcommittees be standing ad hoc or both? And we'll then get into the exercise of using the blue sticky wall over there to have you reflect on potential subcommittee topics that you might find useful. I think that's probably all we're going to have time for, is to get down to about number 4, and leaving the 5th topic here, the subcommittee advising roles and meeting schedules for the October meeting. That will allow board members to kind of reflect on what was discussed today, and also staff to write up and put forward a framework for the board to consider in October. So with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions. Yeah.
And just for the record, we're not cutting the mics so that you can have a different conversation than you would if the mics were on. But because of how much wandering around we're going to have you do, folks who would be listening in on the audio just wouldn't be able to catch it. So we will be capturing the minutes of this by photos that are on the wall and by summaries that staff are writing up, rather than you having to run back to a mic and speak into it while you're up at the sticky wall.
Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the current subcommittee structure. Andrew Detter has promised very fine penmanship, and I have slightly less fine penmanship. But, what we're going to do is record. Andrew's going to record some of the positive attributes that you can think of with the current subcommittee structure, and then. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the current subcommittee structure. Andrew Detter has promised very fine penmanship, and I have slightly less fine penmanship. But, what we're going to do is record, Andrew's going to record some of the positive attributes that you can think of with the current subcommittee structure. And then going to ask the managers to also talk about what they find valuable in the current subcommittees. And then we'll get into maybe some of the less valuable attributes. So starting with the current subcommittees, what are some of the things that you like about it? Randy.
Yes, I like the, I guess I'm an advocate for change on the margins, and I like the current subcommittee structure. I like the fact that we have members of this board with expertise in a given area that have continuity on the subject over multiple meetings and years to help the board reach a consensus on issues. And I think that it creates a forum that board members can work together on in a smaller unit, gain more working relationships, and increase the level of engagement overall in the OWEB process. I think that there are downsides, particularly in the arranging effective meeting schedules that work for everybody to garner, healthy quorums. And I'd like to see the staff explore some kind of electronic, like a webinar or something, where members can meet on a designated basis and still have a healthy interaction.
Okay, so Steve.
Yeah, I do like the subcommittee structure, and I was here prior to any subcommittee being formed, so I think it is a far more effective way to discuss a lot of issues in detail, and so that the board can focus on the highlights of those. Some of the accomplishments, I think it's the open solicitation subcommittee, for example, the dealing with the issue of the extension grants and so forth, and coming up with a resolution of that to go to stakeholder engagement and changing focus. That was done largely through a subcommittee, which I think was valuable. I think the one you actually forgot to list on your paper was the monitoring subcommittee. I don't know if that's foretells anything. But the monitoring committee is probably different than these others because it's a topic that cuts across almost everything we do. And that one, to me, being on that is one of a good example of a committee because it does sort of hit on all of those various topics and probably cuts across and maybe thinking it, are there any other ones like that that might be useful that cuts across everything? And the final thought is that these are all standing committees, but I know in some other boards I sit on, they have something like work groups and things like that where they're more task-oriented. So if something comes up in a meeting where it needs some more in-depth evaluation. Right now, a lot of it's done by the staff, but not to suggest more work for the board members, but possibly some of that could be discussed in a sort of a transitional work group that meets, accomplishes a task for a board meeting and then resolves.
I don't know if we're supposed to use the mics or not.
Depends what you say. We've been trained.
Yeah, I know. So one of the things I really like about it, and especially I want to tie it to the strategic plan in terms of taking bold action. So I think having a small advisory committee kind of role in the subcommittee for advice to staff as we start to take on kind of bold and innovative changes to maybe the way we've done things in the past can really be a place to sense where the board is at. There's a diversity of opinions on the subcommittees. There's not, it's not a uniform structure there. And so I think it's a nice way for staff to kind of get some sideboards and direction from the board before we jump too far ahead with some bold activities.
I wanted to add a little bit to what Randy had said. I think with the way the committees are set up right now and how we form those committees, granted we have new board members, is that there was kind of a selection process where board members could look at those that they were extremely interested in and kind of say, these are my top tier committees that I would love to serve on. And primarily because it's bringing the expertise of those board members around the table to the committees that they feel they could best serve. So I think that's a good thing. I think so you have the Focused Investment Partnership, or the Focused Investment Subcommittee and the monitoring subcommittees, which tend to be pretty regular, pretty good turnout for both of those meetings, and pretty highly functional. And then some of the other committees maybe not as functional, not as much participation. And I think that's because of where our priorities are right now, where our focus is. And once again, it comes back to the strategic plan. So, as we think about this in the future, are there some strategic actions where we're needing a little more focus from those subcommittees? And would it be possible to expand the involvement of the board into those subcommittees rather than keeping the subcommittees limited to a few members when we have an issue like that? And the reason I say that is kind of one of the downfalls is oftentimes we might have a conversation in a committee meeting and flush some things out, and then we bring that back to the board, but then we rehash that conversation as an entire board. So we're having redundant conversations, whereas if we have a focused issue that's focused investment and we want to invite, whether it's the entire board or whatever, to a specific conversation, that might be a way to do it. It's hard logistically, though, and I understand that. And that's been one of the challenges is meeting dates, getting everyone there, and getting enough people there to participate. So.
You don't need to worry about the mic.
Oh, that's right, we're not taking. Can I just speak? You can. I can speak. Please identify yourself. So I've been chairing the Open Solicitation Committee pretty much since I joined the board, which is about a year and a half ago, and it hasn't been a robust experience. And I think that's because we did have one topic that we took up that people were pretty engaged about, but I think my impression is that's because open solicitation is up and running smoothly, that we really, I don't know, I'm newer, so my impression is there hasn't been a need for much work by that committee, and people weren't showing up. And I think that's partly, including myself once or twice, because I got the calendar screwed up, but I think it's partly because the agendas were pretty light, and so it might be time to reconsider that particular committee, maybe make it an ad hoc committee. But so in general, I think the idea of a committee structure is a good one for this board. It's a big board, and I'm assuming we'll hear from you guys. I have also assumed that there are times when staff really needs for there to be a committee to take items because of timing or other issues that you will be dealing with, given the full board's structure, or schedule. So I guess in general, attributes of a good subcommittee would be taking up something that's compelling for the whole board, for the agency, doing so in a context where it's beneficial to have fewer voices and more expertise, and having providing whatever the staff needs in order to get its work done to move things along.
I like the current structure, and I think some of the attributes that cause me to like it is that we've had the subcommittees that I've been involved with had good staff leadership, and well-organized, good leaders really show in the subcommittee setting. We're also able to, and Jason hit on this, you get an opportunity, board members get an opportunity to select what committee they want to go be on, and if your interest is in monitoring or something like that, you can get on the monitoring subcommittee. And so the way we've got the structure set up, you can follow your interest to do OWEB work. I also like the idea that the subcommittees are pretty flexible and pretty responsive. So if we've got an issue coming up like stage 0 and we're dealing with that, we can focus on that and do a deep dive into it. And we've got some good key technical people or people who bring that technical background to really dig into that issue and provide some good background for us to bring back to the board. So those are just a couple of things.
Randy. It just occurred to me, this is kind of out of left field, but the Nature Conservancy has a committee called the Government Relations Committee. And it doesn't meet regularly. It meets irregularly, and it has specific assignments at a meeting. Anybody on the board can attend that, and they tend to do it because it's really interesting. And the Conservancy brings in outside experts and sources. So I don't know if many of you've met with them, but I know, the Department of Forestry a director might come to a given meeting to discuss the challenges in his sector. And it's really educational. And for that reason, there's a high degree of involvement by the board. And I don't know if it's a fit for OWEB, but it's just I thought of it because of Meg's wise comments about her committee. If there's a subject that we have, for instance, in one of our 7 priority areas, that we would benefit from some outside resource such as tide gates, we'd have somebody that would come to that committee and talk to us about it. Brenda.
2 quick comments. One is, are there committees that these are subcommittees of, or are these committees? I'm a little confused.
Yeah, we're sort of using subcommittee and committee interchangeably.
Okay, so they're basically the same thing. The other observation, I guess, is careful consideration of committee membership, so that these committees don't become siloed discussions, but that there's some connectivity among the committees. And Steve brought this up really well, I thought, with the monitoring committee, that it cuts across a lot of these issues. So should the committee membership be structured such that members of the other committees, there is one member of each of the other committees that serves on the monitoring committee to make sure that there's continuity. And it might be the case with some of the other committees as well, that the committee structure could benefit by having 1 or 2 members from a different committee serve on that committee to make sure that there's good communication. That way we don't get into a larger board meeting and have something come up and other people are wondering why they weren't part of that conversation. I don't know how you do that, but I think there needs to be some thought about.
Yeah, just to follow up what Mayor said, the monitoring committee is composed of people who were taken each from
Okay,
the other.
so it's already done that way. Okay, sorry. Okay.
So I'm going to mention, I'm sitting in this kind of quasi place between board and staff, so I'm going to jump in here, and I might jump in there too. So one thing I want to note about our current structure that I really like that Laura, who was on the board before Barbara, actually brought to us, and that was the one thing I really like that we have now is the report out, those 2-page report outs, and that they're presented by a chair of a committee rather than by staff, because I will say from a staff perspective, sometimes what it feels like to us, it's incredibly good preparation. So Renee preparing for a monitoring committee meeting also prepares her for the board meeting that is subsequent. So But us then, when the staff were reporting out what was going on with the committees, it just felt super staff heavy. So I really like the increased engagement of the co-chairs in doing those report outs. I think, I have the same sense that Meg has. So right before Meg became chair of the Open Solicitation Committee, we did the piece that Steve talked about, which was the stakeholder engagement, which was a big lift and really good. And then what, right? Then what was the Open Solicitation Committee working on? Courtney had 4 years of monster lift around operating capacity. That committee was ultra engaged in that. And then, and so that's one of the things that I see as a challenge is our current structure does two things. One, it feels like it forces staff to try to figure out what a topic might be for a committee meeting so that we can keep the meetings regular. So that, for me, is a bit of a challenge. And two, they ebb and flow. The other thing that has come up, and I'm going to pick on Bruce and Jamie in part because I got to go with them to the Rules Committee and they were a riot to go to together, the two of them. But they've both raised things with me over recent time periods. Jamie around some of the tribal conversations that she's been talking about, Bruce around voluntary carbon markets and climate change. That it is, the way our topics are set up right now, it's very difficult for those conversations, in my mind, to come in. So it's, you know, we're talking about ecological priorities with FIP. Well, we want to talk about tribes. Where do we put tribes in a FIP committee conversation? And they don't really fit in an operating committee, and they might fit in open solicitation, but it's a way broader conversation than that. Same thing with voluntary carbon markets. And so what I see, Will raised it yesterday, when we've got a passion around a policy issue, I actually think this committee structure doesn't necessarily, when we have issues around our grant making, this is the perfect structure. When we have issues around policy, I think I've found it to be challenging to tell board members where we put it.
And maybe a follow-up to that, Meta, is, you know, and this gets back to Meg's point, I mean, we could have some of those ad hoc committees that are, they meet very infrequent, but they meet when there's a specific issue. So I've heard that same concern in terms of tribal issues and tribal policy issues and how do we deal with tribes. It could be that we have an ad hoc tribal committee that when an issue comes up or when there's a discussion like was brought up today in terms of how we include tribes in our rulemaking process, we can have that ad hoc committee come together and tackle it, similar to what we do on the acquisition stuff. So we have that acquisition, it comes together for that specific purpose to work through the acquisitions to prepare, and then they're done, as opposed to meeting frequently like some of the other committees. So having the ability to be scalable in where we want to go with the committees versus having these fixed committees and then trying to figure out where stuff fits in the fixed committees might be a way to look at it.
I did forget, I should raise this, I had it with a square around it so I would not forget, and I probably forgot. There are just two technical things as we talk about this that I almost would put as challenges, but just a reminder because we are a public board, public agency. We do have an issue around quorum, so we have to be really careful about the number of voting members that we get onto different committees. We run into quorum. And we also have a decision-making issue. And so to be very clear, committees, when they make a decision, have to be in public meeting. So the FIP committee, when it meets to give a recommendation to the board, has to meet in public meeting. The acquisitions committee meets to get more in-depth knowledge and understanding about those acquisitions so we have better expertise on the board, but they do not make recommendations. And so just something for you guys to have in your head that you are bound by a couple of different things. We have no problem doing public meetings for subcommittees, but just recognize that you head down different paths. And if you head down the path of making recommendations, then it changes how we hold those conversations.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So then the act of, say, the FIP committee making a recommendation to the board is a decision?
We are very careful.
For the board then to vote on?
Yeah, we are very careful. We do not put something in front of you. So we'll talk about, hey, like stage 0, Renee will bring somebody in. We're already headed down the path of bringing to the board a stage 0 recommendation. We talk to the committee about how should it look, and we want Alan to have more expertise so that he can talk about it. But we don't ask the monitoring committee to say should we or should we not. And that's the split. We do it, how do we make sure you're more informed? How do we present it to the board in a manner that the board can make the most effective decision possible?
I'm a little confused then. So are the committees then decision-making bodies?
They are
or
not.
They're recommendation.
The FIP committee becomes a decision-making body right now in the FIP selection process, and we do a public meeting. So we announce it, we mic it, we do all of that stuff. But, so in the case when we shift to that with a committee, we make a formal shift and we announce that we're making it.
So other board members could come in on that FIP meeting then if it's a public
Yes.
meeting?
Right.
So,
And I think it did. I think Will.
Randy did.
Randy showed up, yeah. But Will was on it. That's right.
but the FIP committee is, the decision is to recommend something to the board,
Yes.
right? Okay, and that triggers, the
Yep.
recommendation triggers the
Yep.
public record.
If you're recommending to staff, if you're having a conversation with staff about staff stuff, you're fine. That's why our review teams don't sit in public meeting law,
Yeah.
because they are not, they recommend to staff, staff then puts a funding line and brings it to you.
Bruce and then Eric. Well, Eric's been politely waving his hand for much longer than I have, so let's go first.
So can the committees go as far as developing options without selecting one as a recommendation so that there's a range of things to be considered?
Yep.
So you can go to that step without the meeting being public, but you can't select one of those? Okay, thank you.
So, getting back to the first comment about, or your first comment about Jamie's issue with tribal and mine with carbon sequestration. My first desire, and to be on the FIP committee, was that maybe we could establish a FIP category for carbon sequestration. And as it was discussed with different people, generally, it became clear that it was something that went across virtually all the FIP categories, and also had potential application in open solicitation issues. But now I'm back to zero because I don't have, how do I get from my passion of this should be something that is involved, permeate the entire OWEB organization and all of our decision-making, but how do we get from that passion to some sort of application? And I don't see a vehicle to do that. It's not on the FIP subcommittee. I like serving on it, but it's not there. It's not with discussions at the general board meetings. So whatever you come up with, just make sure that we can do what I want to do.
To do that here in a little bit. And that is why we didn't mic this conversation.
Well, kind of going to Bruce's point, the other thing about if we were to go to a place where we were having committees about topics not related to grant making, it's also signals to the world that these are priorities for the agency. I mean, the existence of the committee has significance as well. And so, and I'm in favor of choosing a couple of those. I have one in mind, but very interested in water infrastructure. But I think part of the conversation is what do we want to convey to the world about what priorities might be for the agency?
When I first looked at this, the existing structure and the potential proposed structure, the thought that came to mind was, right, what we've done in the past is done more vertical around different issues, FIP and others, and the potential to at least consider or think about is more of a horizontal look, and it touches on comments made earlier in this discussion. And the go-to for me was the continuous improvement model, so the plan, do, check, act type thing, where all the planning pieces of all these different things tie into that, and then the act is us actually carrying them out and performing the work, and the check being the monitoring and the auditing and some of this, and then the act being the improvement, the communication of it. So that was one thought that came to mind. So I don't know if conversation's heading that direction, that's one way to think about this. But then I was also trying to think about what, to the comment about some having a lot of things on the agenda and others having fewer things, what kind of big buckets could we potentially create that would have ongoing agenda items, including, and most importantly, of course, Bruce's item. But we go on tour, the two of us, but we're cheap. Some of the different buckets was one, kind of a big picture of vision and goals, this long-term planning and thinking, so that we can make sure that some of the investments are on that, helping us stay on that trajectory, or recognizing with some of our great partners where some of the gaps are and where some of the opportunities may be. Partnerships, of course, is critically important with stakeholders and communication to stakeholders and those relationships. The results and outcome piece, so it'd be the measuring the data, but that piece of are we performing towards our long-term goals? And then also some of the organizational value and effectiveness, be the auditing, the organizational development, transparency, oversight, all these, and communication of that. You know, one of the things I think is becoming more and more important for public agencies is effectively communicating their value to the public and doing that in a transparent manner to build and maintain public trust. And we're handling a lot of public resources and trying to show so that doubts, you know, there's always challenges that come up, but we want to just constantly show the value and demonstrate that value. And so having that be kind of baked into some of the work we do, I think is really important.
You know, one other thing that, kind of an observation, is there are times when committee meetings are very much about work products, very much about creating those options or having a dialogue about specific topics. And then there's very much that time where it's more information in for the committee members. So it's a discussion of dialogues that have come up with staff and kind of just vetting that with committee members so that the committee members can be better informed to communicate with the colleagues on the board. And so those two processes are very different and may require a different amount of time, different amount of focus. So I don't know how we parse that out, and that's to get at the point where sometimes we have a very low showing, for example, on a specific topic or a specific day. We're just not able to get the bodies there. But if we showed that specific topic or that specific day was dedicated to options and output, that we needed everybody's focus, perhaps we could get more involvement in those discussions versus there's some days where not having the number of people there is fine because it's more information out, and then we can recircle back late at a later date. So I don't know how we intertwine those two and kind of think about that from a scheduling perspective.
So I also wanted to give managers an opportunity to weigh in on what you see as providing value in the current subcommittee structure, and also you can go ahead and probably address any or note any of the concerns or challenges that you find as well.
I'm happy to start. So from staff perspective, when we have a new big lift, a new big initiative, the subcommittees have been, or committees to your point, Brenda, we don't have committees that we're subbing off of, have been really critical to thinking through in a deliberate fashion how we structure those, the sideboards that Debbie mentioned, potential pitfalls, questions and issues that will be important to the full board, and that has been especially true in focused investments, which is no surprise, but if I reflect back before we went through the agency reorg and we were just standing up the program, the subcommittee was critically important in that. And then more recently with monitoring, we had a backlog of work to do, plus an incredible interest from the board in digging into this. So I think just making sure that when we have situations like that, we don't lose that great benefit that the subcommittee structure has offered. I think to Maida's point, the subcommittee structure is what it is largely because of the long-term investment strategy, and that is why we structured it in this way. We wanted it to align with our investment areas and then have this cross-cutting monitoring that pulled from the insights of different subcommittees, but we have evolved as an agency. So I think figuring out how we have the ability, and whether it's ad hoc on a particular topic instead of having an open solicitation subcommittee, how we still can honor when those types of needs exist around our funding, but then create space for things like climate change, carbon sequestration, tribal, I mean, any number of other issues that will crop up and need some focus time. I think determining appropriate role of the board, we expect you to serve in this oversight and kind of policy capacity. At times, Jason's right, though, we are talking about specific work products. And so I think getting a sense from you about the elevation or the span of elevation that you're comfortable with. Are we using you in the right way when we convene you as part of the subcommittees? And then just echoing the points about it's really challenging to align schedules. We appreciate, I think, the turnout that we do have, certainly when there are more of you in those subcommittee conversations. It's more effective because we have that diversity of opinions and perspectives. But, I think also just thinking through what is the frequency and additional commitment that's realistic, given that you all have a lot on your plates. But we definitely appreciate, probably beyond words, how much your insights have helped us to stand up, especially some very big lifts in recent years.
I would add that, well, two things, I guess. One is that we've got typically board agendas that have, 20 or so items. This book is kind of thin compared to the normal one. So there's a lot in there. And I kind of see a parallel to our regional review team process. So each of those teams is looking at 20 to 40 applications in any given cycle. And many of those teams have gone to, it's not a committee, but a lead reviewer process where reviewers on the team are assigned a couple of applications where they take a deeper dive into it. And so when we come to the review team discussion, they all should have at least looked at the applications, but there's someone or two people on that team that has taken that deeper dive and can maybe speak to some of the issues and has attended the site visit for that project. So in a similar way with the subcommittee structure, with so many agenda items on some of these things, the committee process gives an opportunity for a subset of board members to have taken that deeper dive or look into the details of a particular agenda item and can speak to it and help your colleagues understand what the issues are around that topic and what's been discussed from a policy level. The second thing I would say is that policy conversation. The subcommittees really help keep us from operating in a bubble because you've got perspectives we don't have, and we need those perspectives, and it's helpful to have them in between these quarterly board meetings as we're working and developing through these agenda items and work products. So those are the two things that come to mind. I think we've probably hit the concerns and challenges, the topical nature of it. How can we better integrate meaty policy discussions in a committee structure? Do we do something like what Paul suggested with subcommittees that are set up for particular work tasks around a policy issue that might be able to address some of those things? And then, of course, scheduling is always going to be challenging with folks that are busy and have a lot of commitments. So.
I don't think I'd have too much new to add, except it does, the operating capacity over time, the workload is ebbed and flowed, but it's given us space to do maybe a little bit more open dialogue, brainstorming. We've been lucky enough to have Debbie on the operating capacity for tenure, I think, on the board. So there's an opportunity for that, for the history to be reviewed and kind of bring new board members up to speed and for staff to bounce ideas off and prep for board meetings. But I think on the other side, which has been said, is the expectation that if you have a standing committee, it needs to meet all the time, regardless of what agenda topics are, is probably not realistic and not the best use of everyone's time in thinking about how to find that middle ground so that you have enough time to prep and bring a committee together and meet when it's necessary, but to not have an expectation that it has to meet for the sake of meeting. But I think structured appropriately, it gives both the board and staff the opportunity to dive a little deeper and have a different conversation than can be had when there's 18 people sitting around the board and there's a binder full of topics to dive into.
I might echo on a piece of what Courtney said that I think has been a challenge for us is there's a benefit of regularity in that it's on your schedule. And so saying we're not going to meet for a year, some people forget that they're on that committee. We forget who's on that committee. Luckily, we have a list. And then at the same time, you've got like the Focus Investment Committee that is meeting, every 3 weeks to try and launch something or get it out. So just a thing for you guys to think about, that's been a challenge for us is there are times when some board members are going 900 miles an hour and might not have the time to do it. And we've got some other board members who are being underutilized. How do we think about that? The scheduling thing is a huge challenge. And I echo what all of these folks said and would also say, as we think about this, I think we need to be really cautious that our appetite doesn't get too big on committees because you guys don't have time. Just bluntly, we see it. Even when there is a big topical area, we might get one board member who's joining the committee meeting. So I caution us as we get excited to really be, and Eric's gonna force you to be very thoughtful about what we do because it's you. And I don't want my staff having calls where they've prepped for 3 days for a meeting and nobody makes it because we just have too many committees. The one last thing I'll just mention that has also been a challenge for us is we have this amazing new strategic plan. And we chunked stuff in. So like there's one about monitoring. So yeah, it's in the monitoring committee. But like the value of working lands is fully integrated into watershed health. We stuck with open solicitation. But again, this is one of those areas where it's funky. And staff are working on all of these, but in many cases don't have a place to bounce in with subcommittees, and that might be fine. But I also don't want us to forget that they're, in addition to the long-term investment strategy and these big policy lifts, we also have a strategic plan. So that's part of the reason we really wanted to come to you all is there's a lot of different ways we could pick this thing apart. So, and would love your thoughts about it as we go to the next objectives.
How many subcommittees, forgive my ignorance, but how many subcommittees are there?
Go back to 6.
6.
We're gonna count
I saw
6.
5 and then I saw 6. So I'm getting a little
Yeah, because we decided monitoring didn't matter for a while.
Okay, that's why.
Monitoring's just out of the staff report. It's on this list.
Just to follow up what you said, Maida, is that I don't see anything wrong with not meeting. You know, I don't worry so much about forgetting you're on a subcommittee. You remind us, and I think that we meet regularly or quarterly anyway, so there's no reason to meet. You know, I think that's the fastest way to get someone not interested in the committee is to have a meaningless meeting. But one thing the subcommittees could do, following up on your suggestion on the new strategic plan, is to have each subcommittee maybe go through the strategic plan and see if there's things in there and outcomes that they should think about focusing on. Maybe there's another way they could cut it, slice it that way. There may not be anything, but that might be one thing that they should do. And if there's something on there that they want to maybe brainstorm, it might be emerging issues or some process.
So just maybe a question in terms of process moving forward is that we're going to have more conversation in October about this. What do we do between now and October, knowing that we now have several new board members that have kind of starting to come into the fold here? So we've got a few months here in terms of, are we going to continue with the existing committee structure, put things on hold until we make this decision? What's the recommendation, I guess, as we think about it?
Eric has more steps that you still need to go through.
Great. Oh, never mind. I'm getting ahead of us.
Yeah, and we've got time.
Good. Okay.
So, I know we've heard, we have
Jump back to the objectives.
quite a few of the positive attributes from both board and managers. We did get a page of the concerns and challenges, but I wanted to make sure that we got the concerns and challenges covered specifically, and also to bring in experiences with other subcommittees that you may have on different boards, commissions, or other groups that you're working with, both sort of the positives and those more challenging. Was there any other concerns and challenges?
I always worry about the workload on staff to put stuff together for the subcommittees.
Thank you.
You just became the favorite.
They eat this stuff up.
I've served on committees and subcommittees where the sole purpose was to disseminate information. There are better ways for me to get information and more time-effective ways for me to get information than to sit through a conference call send me a text, send me an email, send me a piece of paper. It's fine, I'll read it. But if I'm going to spend time on a committee, on a phone conference, when I get off, if somebody says, "What did you do?" I want to be able to say, "We decided this," or we were briefed and directed this. There should be a deliverable on every subcommittee meeting that we have. Otherwise, it's just an expensive way to transmit information.
Just a quick follow-up on that. For the emerging topics, there are these webinars that occur on all of these topics all the time. You can just sit in front of your computer and participate, ask questions, that sort of thing. And I don't think it would take too much staff time, although maybe I shouldn't say that. But those are the ways I think that information could be disseminated to help us think more deeply about things.
Yeah, and I guess I should say that on the FIP subcommittee, we've always had it. There's always been a deliverable. So
these are two different things.
Just a general rant, not a specific one.
So this actually raises a really good question about what's the purpose of subcommittees. What we've heard that there's limits to them based on them being either public meetings or not public meetings. But what's the ultimate objective? What's being asked of board members' time and energy to kind of move forward? What's this overall goal that we're trying to accomplish, and how is that helping to move the ball forward? And then also, because as soon as Bruce mentioned that, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I hope we could call into some of them, and there's still value there just because of the geography of our state. But maybe that's an important point to also address is what's the purpose?
That's actually a little bit of what we're going to talk about, I think, in a couple of these subsequent ones, because the purpose is whatever you want it to be. We've talked about, from a staff perspective, it is really helpful for us to have some extra board members, one with knowledge. Acquisitions is a great example, where that's just a super complex topic, and just having 3 or 4 board members who can say, yeah, don't worry, Jamie, we've talked about this, we dealt, and for you to trust them that they have. So that's, from a staff perspective, that's really helpful. But, and I think this leads to some of Eric's other pieces here, that is a question for you. What do you want? And that's part of the strengths and weaknesses. We see that of value, and we do all of them by phone right now. We don't do any of them connected to meetings because it's often leading to a decision at a meeting. Mm-hmm. But you guys might say, hey, if we're digging into this stuff, let's set aside some time here, and not worry about that these are long-term things. So don't worry about what we're doing for the next meeting. Let's worry about what we're doing for the next 2 years. But I think, Jamie, your question is great for this group. What do you want out of your subcommittees? And I can't remember, does that come, it's kind of in 1 and 2?
Yeah, well, even getting into 4 a little bit too.
Yeah. Sorry, my bad. I knew it was in there somewhere.
So do we have good positive attributes in any of the concerns and challenges?
Well, I have a question that might be a concern or a challenge. If we go in the direction of some policy committees, what does that look like from the staff's perspective? That seems to me like getting a committee like that up and running could be a pretty heavy lift, but I don't know. I'd like to hear some thoughts on that.
I think what we will do, what we're going to do next almost is actually have board members write down or committee ideas that they would like the board to consider. So it could be policy committees, water infrastructure, carbon markets, Bruce, or could be continuing on with the same structure that currently exists, at least partially. For that focused investment committee, there's some real value there. But I think that, and then off of that, I think we could have that discussion about what that would look like in particular.
And to your point, Meg, I would ask you guys to think about it initially without regard to what impact that has on staff, though. Thank you. So you're trying to
I'm
get in.
kind of
but
thinking about.
You and Barbara are trying to raise your.
Yeah, I'm thinking if I'm a staff person, what do I do?
And then we can come back to you in that step 5 and say, okay, if this is what you want and this is really important, this is what it would look like and this is what would drop. So don't worry now, because we want to know what really matters to you.
Well, and the other piece is it may give us the ability to connect back to the strategic plan, because there are a whole host of strategies within those 7 priorities, and understanding where there may be a constellation of shared interest from board members on a topic could help us crosswalk it to, oh, we hadn't planned to move this until year 2 or 3, but maybe it bumps up in priority in terms of one of the strategies.
Okay. Brenda.
Just a question related to that. So there are 7 priorities in the strategic plan. I think it's correct that there have not been metrics decided on for each of the goals, or how the metrics would be used to help decide whether or not you're making progress. I mean, is there a committee structure that could be used to help do that, or is that something that staff is? I'm not sure where that lies between the board and the staff.
I would say we have a preliminary, very preliminary set of initial metrics that just felt right from a gut level, and cross-checking that with the consultant that we worked with on the strategic plan. We have just recently gone through a staff process to brainstorm, if we're thinking about this priority more broadly, what might be a more robust collection of metrics that we could consider. But we've not in any structured way brought that information to the subcommittees. I think we need to see what plays out with this conversation and determine, is that something that some of it could go to the monitoring subcommittee? Do we form a new subcommittee? Is it something that goes to the exec committee? I think there certainly is potential to utilize a committee structure in some way to do that, but I don't want to presume what we would call that.
So my suggestion, Brenda, on that one is, as we go to this next step, from your perspective, you might say, hey, I think maybe we should have a committee for each of the 7 priorities. Or you might say, I think we should have a committee that's looking at metrics. And get it up there, because I think that's our challenge, is even right now, we're in the early phases of getting that together, but I don't know where we would bring it. You might also say at the end of this, that gets prioritized low, and you say, you know what, staff, do it, bring it to the board. We want that thing to land with you. But I think it's really important to make sure it gets up here so you guys have a chance to decide what you want to do with those things.
I'm not sure that there are other ways maybe to approach some of these issues other than subcommittees. And I was thinking about Will's testimony yesterday, and over 2 or 3 minutes. At any point, there might be a member of the board. Jamie might want to do it on tribal relationships. She might convince or want to work with Jason prior to that and come. If there was a way to carve out at a meeting, a board member could request a 15-minute segment. And basically, so if I wanted to talk about something, let's say carbon sequestration, or voluntary carbon market, if I could come in and have 15 minutes to speak to the whole board saying why I believe it should be integrated into the mission statement, grant categories, the strategic plan, why I think, and if I can make a compelling enough argument to the general board and get a census, a majority of the board, certainly a census at that point, then it could be directed back to staff to say, why don't we start looking at that and seeing how it might fit in, where we could work it in. That might be the way to initiate the discussions rather than just setting up a subcommittee of some sort.
And I think we can, so in that step 5, the piece that you just raised, I really appreciate that, because that's one of the things as we come back to in October, we could say, here's 3 different, here's what subcommittees would look like. here's another mechanism. And so I think that idea is really good for us to take back as we're developing for you number 5 and say, here's a way you might do that. And there may be other ways too.
I was just going to share on a previous national work group that I served on that was long-standing. We ended up moving away from standing committees. We initially started with those, and they served for many years, and they started getting stale, and membership wasn't changing. We were not really getting a lot of participation. We went to a model that really became far more ad hoc, similar to what you're suggesting, Bruce, where you would get a presentation to the whole work group, and interested members would basically become an ad hoc committee. Whoever could make those calls, and they typically were calls, would work through those processes to a point where you ended up with a work product that could then be delivered to the entire body. And so that was just a thought, a different model of how you might approach that.
So in that case, you kind of vote by your participation. You say, I care about that, I want to get on that committee.
Yes.
And if Bruce raises it and everybody says, Bruce, that's an amazing idea, I'm not interested in being on the committee, then Bruce knows he's a committee of one. And
So, and I know Eric keeps trying to grab us and pull us back to the specific questions, but just to run with the conversation a bit. One of the things that I'm still learning, and I'm understanding the great work that so many folks have done for so many years, so I apologize if this is, but what I'm still looking for is that big picture needs assessment of what are we trying, what's the vision, what's that long-term plan, that's, where are we trying to get to, what are the risks to getting there, where are the gaps, how do we get there, how do we work with our partners to get there, and then what are some of those solutions. So we think about carbon sequestration, I think it's a phenomenal tool. I totally on board. I'm really excited about that as an idea, but I'm still wanting to make sure we have this big picture where we're trying to get to, and then there's the discussion of metrics. Well, how do we measure how we get there, and what are some of the tools for us getting there, and things like as specific projects, carbon sequestration. It can be a really good focus area, or we can just see how other projects that we're maybe calling something else have that additional value. And so one of the things that I'm very interested in seeing is what is the big picture vision that OWEB is perhaps being the catalyst for and bringing our partners in to make sure there's kind of this shared long-term vision. And that's also in the governor's priorities of a 100-year water vision I thought was so important. Those big picture visions we're trying to get to, trying to figure out what those steps are, and then using those different tools and along the way seeing whether, and some of the how is developing the partnerships to get there, and that's, that's a piece that's there in the communicating with the public. But I'm really interested in seeing that long-term vision piece and the assessment, and then bringing in the ideas and the different tools from our toolbox to help get us there. So
that just struck a piece with me, Jamie, that I think as we think about, which is what Eric really wants us to do next, is getting some things up on the wall. I think maybe we have that in a couple of ways. One, we have the strategic plan that really says these are the 7 areas that we want to focus on. And 2, we have the who we are. We are an investor. And so I think maybe the challenge is, as I think about water infrastructure, as I think about the tribal piece, as I think about the carbon markets, is us being incredibly clear when Bruce says, I want to focus on climate change and voluntary carbon markets, that we don't just say, we want to focus on climate change and voluntary carbon markets. We then force ourselves back into the strategic plan and say, why, as a funder, who we are a funder, we are an investor in local organizations, as that entity, why does climate change and voluntary carbon markets matter? And I think a subcommittee would be great for that. Why is it relevant? And then what are the buttons that a funder can push? Training, tweaking our grant review process to have a focus on this, just asking the question of grantees, helping grantees better understand, because we are not changing the carbon world. We're not going to be doing that. But so I think for each of these topics, we're super clear about, we do have that vision, mission, this is our role. I think about that, Jamie, the conversations we've had about tribes that are and Jason as well. As an investor, how do we help elevate tribal priorities and tribal participation? is a very unique conversation that's OWEB oriented versus how do we just make tribes better, right? That's, you know, so as long as we're continually coming back to this is what we do and this is how we operate, I think a lot of these topics could really help strengthen how OWEB sees itself in the world and how OWEB invests in the world.
Sorry, just to, but to what end?
And I think it's
So
to
as
the
an
strategic
investor-
planning.
But even the strategic plan, as I'm looking at it, it talks about the values, and it talks about some of the how we do it, and,
Yeah, I think that brief one probably isn't the best. I think our big one that has all the who we are actually does that part. This is how we approach the world. These are the mechanisms and tools we want to use. You're right, the priorities and strategies get us to the weeds pretty quick, but I think, and I don't have the.
Well, and I would say even reflecting back to our statutes that outline why we were formed, and the intent of us serving in a very important role as funder to address needs around native fish and wildlife habitat and water quality. I mean, I think we need to make sure it's connected to that core intent and mission around the agency. Certainly something like, you know, how do we improve partnerships that incorporate tribes or climate change issues? I think as long as it's connected back to that end of our role as a funder with these ultimate outcomes around improvements to habitat and water quality in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, that we have a constitutional mandate that is native fish and wildlife and habitat and water quality, period. That is what we do, and there are a suite of things we are allowed to do underneath that are pretty broad. And so keeping ourselves in that space of, as we think about climate change, as we think about water infrastructure, as we think about tribal issues or other things that folks bring up, how are those helping advance the constitutional mandate of our organization, and at the same time lifting the things we know matter? Because we could do that stuff without ever talking about climate change, but I think there's a reason, Bruce, that topic, that it feels like that topic needs to happen here, and we just haven't been able to find a space to do it.
So kind of bring us back to a process question, and Jamie mentioned this earlier, you know, kind of the purpose, what's the purpose of the subcommittees? And as I reflect on the subcommittees that are in existence now and have been in existence, I think to a certain extent, some of that purpose is around supporting the work of the board. I mean, if you look at them, they're process-based, funding-based. Look at, you know, their operating capacity. Well, we have a whole funding mechanism for operating capacity, and the subcommittee provides guidance and advice around how that structure and processes work. The FIP subcommittee, there's a whole process and funding mechanism around how that. So there's a certain amount of purpose to the subcommittee that drives the decisions we make at the board level, rather than just topics that are of interest, right? There's definitely some business component to the subcommittee structure, and I don't think we want to lose that.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah,
That we are a funder.
Right.
I was just thinking about that. There's kind of a transactional guidance piece.
Right.
And then there's the let's make sure that we are investing in ways that consider new topics that are coming our way that are going to affect our success in the future. So climate change is clearly one of those, right? So, but traditional ecological knowledge, where does that fit into the decisions we make? These sorts of larger guiding principles that we need to be taking into consideration when we make decisions. So there's a transactional piece, and then there's kind of a visionary piece. And I'm not sure that those are all going to be captured within one committee structure. I think they might need to be considered separate.
Well, I think when I was talking about the advocacy potential at first to introduce, it was exactly what Brenda's talking about, not to say that this is an important topic. Well, everybody knows this, but to say why it is integral to the mission, why it's integral to the strategic plan, why it's integral, and why we as a group, as an organization, are uniquely situated to advance that in pursuit of our already stated aims, both statutorily and strategically by our plan. So that's that's the convincing up front, the arguments that, somebody would want to make to the board, and to get everybody to say, yeah, that fits. It fits, it's important, B, it fits, we can do something about it. Now how, then we go to the subcommittee, how do we do something about it?
So I think this is a great conversation that I think will also probably continue at the October board meeting. And cognizant of the time that we have right now, and in the remaining few minutes, would like you to, Kathy, would you mind passing around the notes behind your laptop?
And most tables most folks have them. Oh, do you have different sticky notes?
The colors don't matter.
Okay, so they have a bunch in front of them already.
Yep. Okay, so it looks like everybody.
How many we need? How many we need?
Except for in the corner. So just want you to take some time to write down
However many.
your subcommittee
Oh, we're writing down?
ideas. So it could be a policy subcommittee, be one of the current subcommittees that you really want to see go forward. Could be something related to the strategic plan. Open to everything at this point.
One per sticky note.
One per sticky note, and you have to do at least 2. And then once you have it down, you can put it up on the blue sticky wall here, and I think at that point, we'll probably, maybe after the meeting, probably lump them together in like areas. And then in the interim between now and October, you may receive a survey from OWEB staff asking you some additional questions on the subcommittee ideas. And then we'll definitely be picking it back up in October.
And they'll give you a few extra minutes if you want. I just asked them.
Okay. That's good. Sure.
Item O on our agenda, the director's update.
But it doesn't mean it's all.
And the first item on that is the Washington DC trip report by Meta and Jason.
Am I starting?
Sure.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarten. I was so ready for Jason to just start that one. This is agenda item O, and we do have the updates there. And I did have a request that I'm going to do at the very end of this, if the co-chairs are okay with it. Jamie asked if I would give, based on the capacity conversation this morning, just a real quick update on some of the capacity monitoring stuff that we're talking about. So at the end of this, I can give a quick update on that. So just a reminder for those who've been here and a new item for those who are new, we have started going every year now to Washington, D.C. to lobby for the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund. States agencies are allowed to do that. We keep that funding. It is one of the top priorities on the governor's federal funding priority list. For the natural resource side, there are, of course, other priorities around health and education and other areas. So we go back each year. We now go back with up to 5 other states, the 4 other recipient states, so Alaska, Washington, Idaho, and California, and different variations of those states come each year as a group to really push for this funding and the importance. We did ask for an increase in funding of $5 million, and that's in part because states who did not receive a minimum of $5 million in this program before now receive a minimum of $5 million in this program. And that means that what's left gets spread out a little bit more thinly. And so we're back and we'll continue to push for increased funding for that program as states have increased needs. We'll also, and started a conversation this year with our congressional delegation about the important needs in the Klamath and the role that Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Funding can play through tribal priority in the Klamath area as we need to do some work before the dams come out. So I'll turn it to Jason to talk about details.
Great, absolutely. And I wanted to thank my co-chair, Randy Labby, and the board for allowing me the opportunity to go back. This is the second time I've had an opportunity to go back with a very diverse group of people and talk about funding, and specifically Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Funding. And although that is the point of going back, one of the real strong things that we do while they're back there is really tell the story. And so it was fascinating to go back this time with Liesl Coleman and listen to her story and how they're working locally. Last year I got a chance to go back with Shyla Coleman and talk about Wasco County and how they're doing things differently and pulling communities together to rally some change within these local communities based on the funding that is provided both through PCSRF but also all the other leverage funds that can be provided by having PCSRF. So as we sat down and met with the agencies, it's very clear that, we can talk about funding numbers and we can talk about grant programs, but what they really are focused on is the stories, because they don't get a lot of success stories. It's usually bad, as Paul can say, just coming back from D.C. Oftentimes you're caught up in the negative, and I think what the agencies want to hear is these success stories. They want to know that that money is going to good work on the ground. Now, that being said, as we met with NOAA, they're challenged. When they look at a grant program with significant funding or budget cuts associated with staffing, they're in a tough spot. And so those conversations are always tough, trying to think about how we put more money on the ground for salmon recovery, but also keeping in mind all the tough decisions that the agencies have to make when budgets are being cut. So those are difficult conversations, but what I want to say is that I think the telling of the stories has been the key to the success of the PCSRF program. Likewise, as we met with all of the Oregon delegation, very good, warm remarks, a lot of good conversation, meeting with staff as well as some of the delegates. And really, it was pretty amazing the amount of support that this program has. I think everybody sees that there is some difference being made. Oftentimes, it's hard to see that until you tell the story. But it was a really good trip back, similar to last year. And I think the combination of going back and telling the Oregon story, but also combining that story with Idaho and Washington and in the past California and Alaska, all at the same time around the same thing, really kind of promotes an infusion into the conversation. And so it's just a really good opportunity for us to share that message, and I appreciate the opportunity for going back. So thank you.
Questions for Jason or Meta on the Washington Trip Olympics?
It's a walking Olympics.
Okay. The next one is the budget and legislative report with Renee and Eric.
Good morning, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. I will start off with the budget piece of agenda item 02, and then we'll turn it over to Eric for a legislative update. So we have completed the 2019 legislative session, so we now have an agency budget. I don't know that it's been signed by the governor yet. I actually haven't checked in the last few days, but we will soon have a signed budget. So really quick background, we start off with a base budget that we do not need to request any particular approval for individual items within that as part of the budgeting process. We do, though, when we request specific policy option packages or POPs, we do need to request support and ultimate approval of that, both through the governor's recommended budgeting process and then ultimately through the legislative budgeting process. So we've updated you about that iteratively over the last several months. Since the April board meeting, the things that have changed, which ultimately landed us where they did budgetarily, one is that the May 2019 revenue forecast came out. You probably remember a couple months ago seeing a lot of press about these stunning revenues that the state ultimately ended up not expecting but receiving, both on the general fund side and the lottery side, revenue side. So that ultimately ended up resulting in us having about a $7 million increase in our 2019 to 21 budget for lottery revenues. So that's quite helpful as we're thinking about all of the needs for restoration and conservation work on the ground that we hear from our local partners about. So if you look at the bottom of page 1 of the director's update, you'll see the bulleted list of the POPs that were included in our budget that was approved by the legislature. So the program continuity package that included 2 positions was approved in whole. One of the positions, the Conservation Outcomes Coordinator position, Audrey Hatch is in that position, was transitioned from limited duration to permanent. And that is an incredible lift in terms of some of the outputs and outcomes reporting and quantification that we've been working on in recent years. We do also have the Conservation Outcomes Specialist position continued as limited duration. In the program enhancement package, we were quite fortunate there too. The Partnerships Coordinator position was approved, and I think that was referenced during the spending plan discussion yesterday. We have advertised for that new position, given that we have 5 new FIPS coming online. There's a lot of work in the grant program associated with the FIPS, so that position will certainly help. We also received $325,000 in contracting funds. That's certainly, it's not the whole amount that we had requested, but an increase of what we've had previously, and will really, really be helpful as we're not only carrying out responsibilities such as some of the land acquisition monitoring that we do, the due diligence associated with land and water acquisition, but also some of the monitoring needs that we have potentially associated with the capacity evaluation that Maida referenced. You'll see the increase of just over $7 million in lottery funds. We received approval of almost $16 million in carry forward, both a combination of federal funds and other funds. The $500,000 for the Forest Collaborative grant funds that Phil Chang talked with you about yesterday. And then approval for $2 million in federal funds from NRCS in support of those local capacity TA grants that were also mentioned yesterday. In terms of what was not ultimately included in the agency budget that was approved by the legislature, one, we did not receive the internal auditor position. That was something that had been added within the governor's recommended budget, not only in our agency's budget, but across several other agencies. I think a total of 14 agencies were proposed to have internal auditors added. We did not receive the online systems project manager position that was in part of the program enhancement package. The conservation policy and strategy policy option package that we had requested contracted funds for in support of some of the interagency large-scale initiatives such as the SageCon work, some of the water infrastructure work. We did not receive that funding. And then ultimately, we didn't receive approval for expenditure limitation in the event that we would have additional dollars coming in for grant funding focused on Upper Klamath Basin habitat restoration and improvement. That's okay because we didn't actually have a clearly identified fund source for that quite yet, but we will continue to work with our agency partners and tribal partners, plus local stakeholders in the basin to explore options for supporting that work in Klamath. So I think with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions on the budget side.
Maida.
One comment, Maida Lofsgarden for the record, and I had this in my notes to talk about during the committee conversation, but promptly forgot. While we did not get the auditor position, the conversations we've had amongst the agencies, particularly agencies of our size and dollar investment, is that we probably might want to start a audit committee. Which we've not had in the past, so that will be something we'll be bringing forward to you guys. It will look a little different than this. It's typically a committee with a couple of, somebody from the executive team, a couple of board members, and then external folks. And this is performance audit, not fiscal audit. The Secretary of State's office does our fiscal audits. We are not asking for that, but it's how are our internal processes and procedures, and are they giving us the accountability that we need? So more to come on that.
Question, Bruce?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. We don't have to go through Secretary of State for audit services. There are DAS audit services available to the smaller agencies. I was actually pleased not to see that go through, thinking that if we need to do auditing, you can go to the governor's office and get DAS if we deem that necessary.
Any other board questions for Eric and Renee? Oh, you haven't finished. Yeah, that's all right.
Thank you, Randy. For the record, Eric Hartstein. I'll be brief. So the policy bills that directly involved OWEB this session, don't want to belabor the point as we talked about the OAHP bills yesterday during that agenda item. Also probably don't need to spend too much time on House Bill 2020, the cap and trade, that OWEB would have been involved in some of the rulemaking involved in that. One bit of policy that did make it into the end of session, the Christmas tree bills, was the $6 million to Business Oregon for a tide gates and culvert program. And accompanying the bill was a budget report from the Legislative Fiscal Office that was directing OWEB to coordinate with Business Oregon to develop a grant and loan program to repair and replace tie gate and culvert infrastructure along the coast. So OWEB staff will be working with Business Oregon to develop that program as the dust settles on the legislative session. So with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions.
Debbie.
For the record, Debbie Holland, was the $6 million for that, was that a one-time?
For the record, Eric Hartstein, yes.
Okay. Thanks very much. And Renee, if you could stay and do item 3.
Yep. So flipping over to, for the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director, flipping over to item 03. This is just a brief update about the various improvements that we've been making to OWEB's online systems. I think we last updated you in 2017 in Lebanon about this. Back in 2016, the agency launched our first online grant applications. That was launched after an extensive scoping process with applicants, grantees, to really understand what some of their needs were and what they would be looking for in an online grant application system. Since then, we've kind of taken IT improvements and run with them and have rolled out a whole host of improvements to online systems. Our online systems are not something that the board interfaces with at all. I think in most of your cases, maybe a few of you have logged on here and there to look at grant information, but it really is critical to both how our business processes are implemented, but then also from a customer service standpoint. For many, many years, we had folks filling out paper grant applications or maybe transitioning to PDFs, and so this has been much appreciated from our customers from the standpoint of really making our processes more streamlined and usable for them. So some of the recent improvements that we've made, one is we continue to port over additional grant offerings into the online grant application portion of the system. So Courtney mentioned that this was the first cycle that the council capacity grants came in via the online system. Our land and water acquisitions are coming in via the online system, and we're about to launch the new partnership technical assistance offering through the system. In addition, we've been working with staff at Oregon Department of Agriculture to begin building an online grant application for the weed grants that we coordinate on with ODA. We have continued to make improvements to the applications that currently are in the system. So kind of the big four of restoration, technical assistance, monitoring, and stakeholder engagement. We have an ongoing process to receive feedback from users of the system. They have a little feedback button they can click at the top of each window within the system. So we get very real-time input from them, including when they're very frustrated about something that they're trying to do. And so we accumulate all of that and then triage it into a set of work that is conducted, improvements that are made to address issues or maybe make improvements to help clarify process steps during a closed window when our system is closed and we're not taking in new applications. On more of the staff process side, we've developed some functionality that essentially takes information about all of the newly awarded grants and ports that into an auto-generated grant agreement. So definitely a time savings for staff on that front, and really great reduction in potential data entry error that we would experience sometimes in the past. There's a new dashboard that's in development for project managers. Sometimes our project managers will have 200 open grants that they're looking at, and so a dashboard to really help them get in, understand what the work items are in front of them, and quickly and easily power through those grantee requests that they have. That's going to be launched next month. And then we've started developing some training videos for applicants and grantees so they better understand using YouTube videos how to interface with our system. So a great step in the right direction there. And then Eric Williams referenced the project lifecycle piece yesterday. So really trying to integrate throughout the life of a grant from the time of grant application through the post-implementation status reporting, the information that is in our system to really streamline how much new information is being entered at these different points by grantees, but also making sure that we're getting information from our grantees at the right time when it's freshest, and can also help to flag for our project managers when communication touch might be needed, when a check-in might be needed, because things maybe are moving a little bit more slowly than anticipated. So work continues on project lifecycle. And I think that all told, we've already made some great strides. We still have a lot of work to do, though, for that full integration of the system. But staff have been incredible in terms of the time that they've devoted to really thinking through how to make the system as usable as possible for our grantees. So happy to answer any questions.
Brenda.
Brenda McComb for the record. Renee, has there been any effort or thought, or maybe this is very long, farther down the road, regarding data archiving and data management, where you can have all of these wonderful projects that are collecting all this wonderful monitoring data kind of brought together? And I talked with Alan about this, and he's kind of warned me about some of the can of worms that this might open up, but it does seem like there's an opportunity here.
Yep. So thanks for that question, Brenda. For the record, Renee Davis. So a couple things. One, we already, as part of our monitoring grants, have a requirement that grantees submit data to the kind of official data holding agencies. So for water quality, Department of Environmental Quality, and then for fish, wildlife, and habitat data to Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Sorry, Bruce, I still look at you when I reference ODFW. So that, though, does not necessarily capture some of the learnings that we know emerge from these monitoring projects. And so that's another piece that we've been working on as part of Project Lifecycle, is how do we ask very targeted questions that will help get at a collection of lessons learned about how do you implement monitoring, what are appropriate methodologies or best practices around monitoring guidance that we can then quickly and easily harvest out of the system. So that's that piece. And then on the archiving front, we actually have a team convened that is working through the archiving policy currently. There are a set of public records retention requirements that are provided by Secretary of State, but there are some facets to our grant making that might warrant retaining information for a slightly longer period of time, and we're working through that in parallel.
All right, thank you.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, one addition to this, and this is a sales pitch for you all, especially our new members. While this is not directly related to your question, Brenda, which was about monitoring and that data, we also have the Oregon Watershed Restoration Inventory. For all of you, I'm sure the existing board members have this link memorized. I know I don't. But I really recommend you go out there. That is a public-facing database of every single on-the-ground project that we have done. You can go in, you can find your watershed, you can click on a project, it tells you the type of project, it gives you a summary of the project, how much money there was, how much match. It is a phenomenal database, so I also really recommend, and that is not archived. That is information that exists from the time and does not follow the same 5-year archiving records retention policy.
Yeah, and just one additional plug for the record, Renee Davis, I think we're at over 13,000 records in that inventory. That includes our grants and then things like DEQ's 319 grants and then some voluntarily reported projects, but it is incredibly extensive.
And then, again, for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, just one other thing I wanted to mention in terms of Renee's piece here. Just a shout out to Renee and the staff, Eric's staff, Courtney's staff. We are very lucky to have a staff that is really committed to continuous improvement as just a way of doing business. And so when you see this stuff, every time they're looking at an online grant piece, they're connecting that back to how do we make the grantee aware of it? Is it making our processes smoother? We've changed our key performance measures for the legislature to match these. And so a shout out to staff because it's just kind of their base mindset to think in this way. And we've made a lot of pretty amazing improvements over the last few years. So thanks, Renee.
Thank you, Renee. Maida, did you want to?
Yeah. So for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, quickly, Jamie and I had a conversation at break, and I will make this very quick, about some of the things that you all raised about kind of the role of capacity funding. Paul had questions, Molly, Jamie, Bruce, others. And if you flip to the very front where our strategic plan priorities are, priority 3 is our community capacity and strategic partnerships, achieve healthy watersheds. And I just want to note there are 2 things we're kicking off. And so we were taking notes about all of you who are interested. We have 2. One is to evaluate and identify lessons learned from OWEB's past capacity funding. So those of you who are on capacity and monitoring, you had a joint call a little while back. We are kicking off a full evaluation of our 20 years of investments in conservation districts and watershed councils. We have informed councils and districts about that. We've talked to them about Connect. This is at Connect and other places. This is not about how is an individual council or district performing, but how is our money is our trigger. How is that funding helping? What are other ways that it could help? What are the lessons we've learned over the last 20 years? That's phase 1. Phase 2 is the champion best approaches to build organizational community and partnership capacity. We're going to have a phase 2 of that evaluation, which is prospectively. Given what we've learned over time and an evaluation of what communities need, not who provides it, but what's the constellation of things that a community needs to be effective. How do we then, looking forward as a board and as staff, determine how best to invest in those things? So it's not going to be coming tomorrow, but you all set that as 2 specific priorities for us to work on, and we are kicking off phase 1 with an RFP that's going to go out soon. And then we do not want to kick into phase 2 until we've finished phase 1, but just a reminder on those that a lot of the very good questions you were asking today, we are investing dollars on your behalf to get answers to those.
Any questions on that subject? Okay, thanks.
All right, we're going to move to agenda item P, which is the FIP priorities, proposed revisions and process for board adoptions of Eric Williams.
And crew.
Oh, and crew.
I'm the window dressing, they're the substance. For the record, Eric Williams, co-chairs, members of the board. What I'm going to do is provide just a little bit of background on this item because most of you were not here when these priorities were first established. So I'll talk a little bit about that and then turn it over to Andrew and Eric to get into the specifics of proposed changes to the FIP board identified priorities. And we've got just a few brief slides here for you. So by definition, the FIP program supports collaborative partnerships, as you know, in achieving prioritized ecological outcomes at the landscape scale. And these conservation initiatives must meet the criteria that are listed on this slide. And those criteria are also reflected in our administrative rules. Partnerships can request for an implementation FIP up to $12 million over 6 years or over 3 biennia to implement these conservation initiatives. And so today, we're going to focus our discussion on the board identified FIP priorities of significance to the state. And so the next slide lists the ones that we currently have. And the FIP program is premised on working towards measurable ecological outcomes in these 7 specific priorities as proposed by high-performing partnerships. And so these were developed starting back in 2014 when OWEB initiated a fairly rigorous process for determining what the board identified priorities would be. We solicited input from the conservation community across the state. We received 42 detailed submissions articulating what preferences and priorities our stakeholders felt were most important for this endeavor. And then staff and board organized that information into thematic areas, which were then reviewed by expert science teams that we convened on each of those topics. And then they were made available for public comment at the January 2015 board meeting. Those initial submissions were then grouped into 12 thematic areas, and then based on the input we received and board discussion, the board finally adopted the 7 priorities listed in April of 2015. We have detailed memos that describe each of these along with maps showing where these geographies are. And again, each of the FIP initiatives that is funded must address one of these board identified priorities. And the applications that we receive for implementation FIPs have questions in them that get at how each of those partnerships is proposing to make progress toward outcomes in these priority areas. The next slide has a timeline for this process, and again, this is also included in the administrative rules that you adopted for the FIP program. By rule, we do need to revisit these priorities at least every 5 years, and so given that these were first adopted in 2015, we would like to be in position to have the board take a look at them and affirm current priorities for January of 2020 when we do our next submission for implementation FIPs. And so that review process is underway according to the timeline that you see here. And to summarize, staff and the subcommittee, the FIP subcommittee, first discussed the scope and this timeline in September of last year. Soon after that, staff started engaging partner agencies and coordinated with them on revisions into May of this year. And so our purpose today is to update the board on the process, and we're not asking for any decisions today. We want to tee this up for your decision at the October board meeting. All right, and so at this point, I'll turn it over to Andrew and Eric to talk about the specific revisions that we're considering.
Thanks, Eric, and for the record, Andrew Dutter, OWEB staff. So Eric Karsten and I will just provide a summary of the proposed revisions to date on the FIP priorities. If you want, this will reference attachment D in the agenda item. I think it's the very last page of your materials for this agenda item. The 3 priorities that you see on the screen, native fish, coho, and dry forest, are those that at this time have been proposed for revisions. We'll take a closer look at those in just a moment. The other 4 priorities, including estuaries, oak woodland and prairie, closed basin wetlands, and sage grouse habitat, staff reviewed those. We consulted with partner agencies and determined that no revisions to those priorities were needed at this time. So taking a closer look at the 3 on the screen, native fish first, and it's important to note that ODFW was a key partner in this effort. Their consultations and communication with their staff was critical to revising this priority. In fact, Chris Lorian, who we heard from yesterday in the spending plan presentation, was ODFW's lead on this, so big thanks to them for their efforts. First, the previous map, native fish map, and if you'd like, the revised map is just a few pages in at the start of this agenda item, was based on 6-field hucks on the coast and then 4th-field hucks in central and eastern Oregon. So we determined to use instead 5th-field hucks across the state to increase or to have that consistency statewide. It increases spatial resolution in central and eastern Oregon and reduces the previous patchwork nature of those priority designations on the coast. We felt that 5th field huck was an appropriate scale for the purpose of prioritizing these basins. Secondly, the area in southwest Oregon, and this includes the Rogue, Checo, and Illinois basins, was previously eligible for applications but had not been prioritized, and that was due to the relevant conservation recovery plans still being in a draft status such that they were not at a point where they could inform prioritization in those areas. So those areas have now been prioritized as well. Lamprey were considered as part of this this update. In fact, worked closely with the statewide lamprey coordinator at ODFW. And while there is a statewide lamprey conservation plan in development, it is still in a draft state such that it was, we could not draw meaningful conclusions about spatial prioritization of lamprey habitat needs across the state. So instead, at this time, are recognizing the benefits of native fish restoration to lamprey, and perhaps at the next review, whenever that is, a few years down the road, we'll look again at incorporating lamprey needs into the native fish map. Briefly, 2 additional items. The list of reference plans included in the priority was updated. 2 new plans were added, conservation plans in the Rogue Basin for spring and fall Chinook, and then any updated plans that were finalized since 2015 that was noted. And then lastly, again, just highlighting the extent to which ODFW participated in this effort. That included consultation with district biologists, research staff, implementation coordinators, and conservation and recovery program staff to help ground truth the designations that were based on the conservation and recovery plan efforts, and then further refine those designations. So moving to Coho, and this is fairly brief, but one significant revision there, and it's fitting that we're here in the Klamath Basin to be able to share this, but the Klamath Basin was changed from orange, or the lowest priority in the 2015 map, to now green, which is the highest priority. That was done in anticipation of the planned dam removal, and so some language was added to the narrative of that memo related to that update as well. And I'll turn to Eric to discuss the dry forest update.
For the record, Eric Hartstein. So for the dry forest priority, it came up during the evaluation of actually the past 2 rounds that wanted a little bit more robust connection to how the dry type forest was addressing issues related to fish, wildlife, and water quality. So what we did is, working with ODFW staff, was to add some language in the narrative stating that folks coming in for an application must be prepared to discuss how their initiative will benefit Oregon conservation strategy species and/or protect source drinking water. We also added some language knowing that the Department of Forestry is updating their state forest action plan that will be finalized probably in a matter of months after the board adopts these priorities in October, that there may be some changes that would be forthcoming in this priority, and in recognizing that forest fire science is something that's a rapidly evolving field. So wanted to specifically call out that the board may come back to this priority within the 5 years that we had set out with the other priorities. So with that, stop, see if there are any questions for Andrew or I.
Any questions? Paul.
Yeah, not really a question, just a comment. First of all, it is really happy to see lamprey being sort of elevated a little more. And as an FYI for folks, Fish and Wildlife Service, my office, we've had a expanding partnership with the Oregon Zoo on a variety of issues. I now have some full-time staff up there actually doing interpretive work. And I don't know, some of you might have heard that we've helped fund installation of a tank in the northwest section that has lamprey in it, but there's also water sucker in there, and we're trying to get Oregon chub in there as well, so and do the whole sort of first fish off the endangered species list in the country. I'm sorry?
Do they fight with each other?
No, it'll be interesting to see what the lamprey are huge that are in there right now, and they're about 3 times as big as the suckers are. But next door, the bull trout are eating some of the small Chinook. So sorry, Eric, to tell you that. But and that's actually pretty cool to watch. But the kids love it. The kids love it. Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, Brenda?
This all looks great, and this is an incredibly nitpicking point, so I apologize ahead of time. But as I was reading through this, the criteria used for some of the discussion in the write-up refers to indicator species, and maybe that's something that's written into policy. But I just caution you that indicator species is a concept that has been under quite a lot of ecological scrutiny lately, and there have been several papers written by David Lindenmayer from Australia that kind of raise questions around that concept. So you might want to go back and take a look at that.
Thanks for that, Brenda.
Okay. Debbie?
For the record, Debbie Holland. So just a comment as one of the few board members who went through the process to set the priorities several years ago. It's nice to see us just kind of tweaking them and updating them. I think our intention in establishing them was that we were really looking for things that we could turn the dial on, and given that through the focused investment process, and we've been through a couple cycles of focused investment, but we haven't seen the full implementation. So I'm glad that, through this process, we're not finding significant changes to make right now and take us in a different direction. I think we need a couple more cycles to actually see if we're turning the dials on these priorities before we make dramatic changes to them. So I'm appreciative that we're tweaking, but not, and clarifying, but not wholesaling. Or maybe I should be disappointed that we're not wholesaling because we would have accomplished it. Maybe that's a little overly optimistic.
And Jason Robinson, for the record, this is one of those topics that's been a good example of where the subcommittee, in its capacity, is really working well with staff to kind of work through these conversations. It's been really good conversations on the committee side. I don't know if any of the other committee members wanted to add anything, but it has been a really robust, dynamic conversation. Staff's done a wonderful job of keeping us up to speed. So, thank you. All right.
Could I, if I may, just highlight one more point for your consideration? It was in the timeline, but just wanted to highlight that these proposed revisions that we have thus far are going out for public comment at the end of this month in August, so we'll be able to report to you on feedback that we hear through that process in October as well.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Okay, for the record, Randy Lavey, co-chair. We're going to move to item letter Q, the 2017-2019 biennial report that requires some board action. And stay right where you are, Eric, and
move over a seat. So, for the record, Eric Hartstein, Senior Policy Coordinator, on agenda item Q. So the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds has a mission to restore the watersheds of Oregon and to recover the fish and wildlife populations of those watersheds to productive and sustainable levels in a manner that provides substantial ecological, cultural, and economic benefits. And every 2 years, OWEB must report to the governor and legislature on the implementation of the Oregon Plan. And included in the report is a suite of things that we need to include, including an overview of state agency programs addressing watershed conditions, overview of voluntary restoration activities, and a summary of investments made by the board. And while this item is here before the board, recommendations from the board for enhancing the effectiveness of Oregon Plan implementation. So attachment A is the executive summary from the 2015-2017 report. And this summer and fall, staff will be working with agency partners to develop content for the 2019 report, which will be due to the governor and legislature in January of 2020. So in preparation for the board recommendations requirement in the report, staff have been working with the board's executive committee to draft language that you see before you in attachment B, the staff report, which is titled the Draft Biennial Report Board Recommendations. So the language in the draft was actually pulled from the strategic plan, and in particular, the opening remarks from the co-chairs. And it also includes some of the recent examples of implementation of the strategic plan priorities that you might recognize some of the languages coming from the agenda item F in the annual report that came from the strategic plan. So I will stop here and ask if there are any questions or any specific feedback on the attachment B so that we can incorporate the board recommendations into the biennial report.
Maida?
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, one thing I just want to note, you have the executive summary in front of you. The full report is now a fully online report. So there used to be a big book that came out that was the executive, or was the full report. And so there's a lot more depth that goes into the online components and links. From the board, the piece that you see in the executive summary last time and the proposed for this time are components of that, but there is a lot of additional information. And then one other thing I'd note, the thing I like about what the executive committee talked about here in terms of the summary is in the last summary, we said we are working on a strategic plan. And now our recommendations are coming right from that conversation. So it feels like it flows pretty well from our end as well between those two recommendations.
Okay, are there any guidance or questions from the board on this at this point in time? Paul?
Thank you, Paul Henson. As I was reading through this and noting, there's of course, the discussion about private farms, ranches, forest lands, and then in that last paragraph about landscape scale conservation and watersheds. Do we want to mention there's still a perception that OWEB is sort of, non-fed, but a lot of the work that's been discussed this week is including federal land management. And that's such a big issue with the fire and climate and stuff like that. Do you want to call that out or not? I'm sort of offering that up. It's something that I know I hear from folks who think OWEB is still grants to private landowners per se, or private folks and watershed councils, but they're doing a lot of work on federal lands. So not to call out that the federal folks aren't doing what they should be doing. Tony, and Debbie's gone now. I'm not focusing on that, but.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, it's interesting that you ask that question because we've had some of Renee's staff just in the last week or so has been working on behalf of the shared stewardship agreement that Debbie mentioned, determining how many investments we've actually made on federal Forest Service lands. And is it 45 million, Renee? Is that the right number? 25 million matched with 45 million. And so we do have some pretty extensive investments. I think with maybe just a small word change, even when we talk about OWEB grants support community partners to work with farmers, ranchers, forest landowners, state and federal agencies and local contractors, I think, or on state and federal lands. Or I think we could easily add either there or on the second page, just a phrase that will catch that state federal land investment. If the board is amenable. So this will be a motion, so if you're amenable to that, when somebody makes the motion, they need to ask us to reference state and federal lands in your motion.
Jamie?
Jamie McLeod-Skinner for the record. Something that is part of the mission statement is in attachment A, but I don't see in attachment B is some specific reference to how OWEB's work helps local economies. I think that's a really key aspect of the work and important part of the messaging. So I would just also suggest, if similar to your previous comments, that could be kind of tied into the attachment B remarks as well.
Brenda McComb, for the record, I just want to emphasize and reiterate the point that Paul made, is that if you're taking a landscape approach, that it is the multi-ownership landscape, but it's not individual ownerships. Because if we really have a constitutional mandate to improve habitat for indigenous fish and wildlife, they don't recognize political boundaries, so it is that multi-ownership landscape that is really critical here. And I'd also include in the list, if you have a list, the tribal nations.
Would you explicitly, I heard maybe in Jamie's agreement too, do you want us to make specific reference to tribal nations here as well?
I think that'd be great.
Okay. So we have 3 additions.
Barbara.
I just wanted to echo what Jamie had said about the local economies, and I think, Maida, you had said the word local contractors, because I don't see that anywhere in here, and I think that is an important piece, is how it's supporting the local economies.
And local contractors is
Where?
the
I
second
looked
bottom
for
of
it.
the 3rd paragraph, but not the local economies piece. So if you look at the very end of the 3rd paragraph. But I think that might be the place where we could say clean water for Oregonians, healthy habitat for fish and wildlife, and benefits to local economies could just flow right into that.
So for Randy Lavitt, for the record, so far we have local economies to be referenced, federal lands, and tribal nations.
State and federal lands.
State and federal lands, yeah. Any other? Okay. We ready for a motion then?
Make that. Look at your notes to make sure I get it right. For the record, Jason Robinson, I'll make the motion. I move the board adopt the final draft recommendation found in attachment B to the staff report for inclusion in the 2017-2019 biennial report for the Oregon Plan for 7 watershed enhancements, with a couple of additions: local economies, state and federal lands, and tribal nations.
There's a second by Jamie, and the motion's been forwarded by Jason. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, thank you.
So we'll move on to any new business, and I'm looking at Maida to see.
Yes, Co-Chair, we have extensive list of new business that should take the next hour and a half or so. We do not have any new business, and once we adjourn, I will give logistics for meal.
Fantastic. Well, hearing no new business, we'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
All right, for board and staff, we are 99% certain, though Kathy is peeking out the door,